Chapter 8. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 8 of The House of the Seven Gables by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Read by Nicodemus. The Pyncheon of Today. Phoebe, on entering the shop, beheld there the already familiar face of the little devourer, if we can reckon his mighty deeds aright, of Jim Crow, the elephant, the camel, the dromedaries, and the locomotive. Having expended his private fortune on the 2 preceding days in the purchase of the above unheard-of luxuries, the young gentleman's present errand was on the part of his mother, in quest of 3 eggs and half a pound of raisins. These articles Phoebe accordingly supplied, and as a mark of gratitude for his previous patronage, and a slight superadded morsel after breakfast, put likewise into his hand a whale. The great fish, reversing his experience with the prophet of Nineveh, immediately began his progress down the same red pathway of fate whither so varied a caravan had preceded him. This remarkable urchin, in truth, was the very emblem of old Father Time, both in respect of his all-devouring appetite for men and things, and because he, as well as Time, after engulfing thus much of creation, looked almost as youthful as if he had been just that moment made. After partly closing the door, the child turned back and mumbled something to Phoebe, which, as the whale was but half disposed of, she could not perfectly understand. "What did you say, my little fellow?" asked she. "Mother wants to know," repeated Ned Higgins more distinctly, "how old Maid Pyncheon's brother does. Folks say he has got home." "My cousin Hepzibah's brother!" exclaimed Phoebe, surprised at this sudden explanation of the relationship between Hepzibah and her guest. "Her brother! And where can he have been?" The little boy only put his thumb to his broad-snubbed nose, with that look of shrewdness which a child spending much of his time in the street so soon learns to throw over his features, however unintelligent in themselves. Then, as Phoebe continued to gaze at him, without answering his mother's message, he took his departure. As the child went down the steps, a gentleman ascended them, and made his entrance into the shop. It was the portly, and had it possessed the advantage of a little more height, would have been the stately figure of a man considerably in the decline of life, dressed in a black suit of some thin stuff, resembling broadcloth as closely as possible. A gold-headed cane of rare oriental wood added materially to the high respectability of his aspect, as did also a neckcloth of the utmost snowy purity, and the conscientious polish of his boots. His dark, square countenance, with its almost shaggy depth of eyebrows, was naturally impressive, and would perhaps have been rather stern had not the gentleman considerately taken upon himself to mitigate the harsh effect by a look of exceeding good humour and benevolence. Owing, however, to a somewhat massive accumulation of animal substance about the lower region of his face, the look was perhaps unctuous rather than spiritual, and had, so to speak, a kind of fleshy effulgence, not altogether so satisfactory as he doubtless intended it to be. A susceptible observer, at any rate, might have regarded it as affording very little evidence of the general benignity of soul whereof it purported to be the outward reflection. And if the observer chanced to be ill-natured, as well as acute and susceptible, he would probably suspect that the smile on the gentleman's face was a good deal akin to the shine on his boots, and that each must have cost him and his boot-black, respectively, a good deal of hard labour to bring out and preserve them. As the stranger entered the little shop, where the projection of the second story and the thick foliage of the elm tree, as well as the commodities at the window, created a sort of grey medium, his smile grew as intense as if he had set his heart on counteracting the whole gloom of the atmosphere, besides any moral gloom pertaining to Hepzibah and her inmates, by the unassisted light of his countenance. On perceiving a young rosebud of a girl, instead of the gaunt presence of the old maid, a look of surprise was manifest. He at first knit his brows, then smiled with more unctuous benignity than ever. "Ah, I see how it is," said he in a deep voice. a voice which, had it come from the throat of an uncultivated man, would have been gruff, but by dint of careful training was now sufficiently agreeable. I was not aware that Miss Hepzibah Pyncheon had commenced business under such favourable auspices. You are her assistant, I suppose?" "I certainly am," answered Phoebe, and added with a little air of ladylike assumption, for, civil as the gentleman was, he evidently took her to be a young person serving for wages, "I am a cousin of Miss Hepzibah, on a visit to her." "Her cousin? And from the country? Pray pardon me, then," said the gentleman, bowing and smiling as Phoebe never had been bowed to or smiled on before. "In that case we must be better acquainted, for unless I am sadly mistaken, you are my own little kinswoman likewise. Let me see. Mary? Dolly? Phoebe? Yes, Phoebe is the name. Is it possible that you are Phoebe Pyncheon, only child of my dear cousin and classmate Arthur? Ah, I see your father now about your mouth. Yes, yes, we must be better acquainted. I am your kinsman, my dear. Surely you must have heard of Judge Pyncheon." As Phoebe curtsied in reply, the judge bent forward, with the pardonable and even praiseworthy purpose, considering the nearness of blood and the difference of age, of bestowing on his young relative a kiss of acknowledged kindred and natural affection. Unfortunately, without design, or only with such instinctive design as gives no account of itself to the intellect, Phoebe, just at the critical moment, drew back, so that her highly respectable kinsman, with his body bent over the counter and his lips protruded, was betrayed into the rather absurd predicament of kissing the empty air. It was a modern parallel to the case of Ixion embracing a cloud, and was so much the more ridiculous as the judge prided himself on eschewing all airy matter, and never mistaking a shadow for substance. The truth was, and it is Phoebe's only excuse, that although Judge Pyncheon's glowing benignity might not be absolutely unpleasant to the feminine beholder, with the width of a street or even an ordinary-sized room interposed between, yet it became quite too intense when this dark, full-fed physiognomy, so roughly bearded, too, that no razor could ever make it smooth, sought to bring itself into actual contact with the object of its regards. The man, the sex, somehow or other, was entirely too prominent in the judge's demonstrations of that sort. Phoebe's eyes sank, and without knowing why, she felt herself blushing deeply under his look. Yet she had been kissed before, and without any particular squeamishness, by perhaps half a dozen different cousins, younger as well as older than this dark brown, grizzly bearded, white neck clothed, and unctuously benevolent judge. Then why not by him? On raising her eyes, Phoebe was startled by the change in Judge Pyncheon's face. It was quite as striking, allowing for the difference of scale, as that betwixt a landscape under a broad sunshine and just before a thunderstorm. Not that it had the passionate intensity of the latter aspect, but was cold, hard, and mitigable, like a day-long brooding cloud. "Dear me, what is to be done now?" thought the country girl to herself. "He looks as if there were nothing softer in him than a rock, nor milder than the east wind. I meant no harm. Since he is really my cousin, I would have let him kiss me if I could." Then all at once it struck Phoebe that this very Judge Pyncheon was the original of the miniature which the daguerreotypist had shown her in the garden, and that the hard, stern, relentless look now on his face was the same that the sun had so inflexibly persisted in bringing out. Was it, therefore, no momentary mood, but, however skilfully concealed, the settled temper of his life? And not merely so, but was it hereditary in him, and transmitted down as a precious heirloom from that bearded ancestor, in whose picture both the expression and to a singular degree the features of the modern judge were shown as by a kind of prophecy? A deeper philosopher than Phoebe might have found something very terrible in this idea. It implied that the weaknesses and defects, the bad passions, the mean tendencies, and the moral diseases which led to crime, are handed down from one generation to another, by a far surer process of transmission than human law has been able to establish in respect to the riches and honors which it seeks to entail upon posterity. But as it happened, scarcely had Phoebe's eyes rested again on the judge's countenance, than all its ugly sternness vanished, and she found herself quite overpowered by the sultry, dog-day heat, as it were, of benevolence, which this excellent man diffused out of his great heart into the surrounding atmosphere, very much like a serpent which, as a preliminary to fascination, is said to fill the air with his peculiar odour. "I like that, Cousin Phoebe," cried he, with an emphatic nod of approbation. "I like it much, my little cousin. You are a good child, and know how to take care of yourself. A young girl, especially if she be a very pretty one, can never be too chary of her lips." "Indeed, sir," said Phoebe, trying to laugh the matter off, "I did not mean to be unkind." Nevertheless, whether or no it were entirely owing to the inauspicious commencement of their acquaintance, she still acted under a certain reserve, which was by no means customary to her frank and genial nature. The fantasy would not quit her that the original Puritan, of whom she had heard so many sombre traditions, the progenitor of the whole race of New England Pyncheons, the founder of the house of the Seven Gables, and who had died so strangely in it, had now stepped into the shop. In these days of off-hand equipment, the matter was easily enough arranged. On his arrival from the other world, he had merely found it necessary to spend a quarter of an hour at a barber's, who had trimmed down the Puritan's full beard into a pair of grizzled whiskers. Then, patronizing a ready-made clothing establishment, he had exchanged his velvet doublet and sable cloak, with the richly worked band under his chin, for a white collar and cravat, coat, vest, and pantaloons, and lastly, putting aside his steel-hilted broadsword, took up a gold-headed cane. The Colonel Pyncheon of 2 centuries ago steps forward as the judge of the passing moment. Of course, Phoebe was far too sensible a girl to entertain this idea in any other way than as a matter for a smile. Possibly, also, could the two personages have stood together before her eye, many points of difference would have been perceptible, and perhaps only a general resemblance. The long lapse of intervening years, in a climate so unlike that which had fostered the ancestral Englishman, must inevitably have wrought important changes in the physical system of his descendant. The judge's volume of muscle could hardly be the same as the Colonel's. There was undoubtedly less beef in him. Though looked upon as a weighty man among his contemporaries in respect of animal substance, and as favoured with a remarkable degree of fundamental development, well adapting him for the judicial bench, we conceive that the modern Judge Pyncheon, if weighed in the same balance with his ancestor, would have required at least an old-fashioned 56 to keep the scale in equilibrio. Then the judge's face had lost the ruddy English hue that showed its warmth through all the duskiness of the Colonel's weather-beaten cheek, and had taken a sallow shade, the established complexion of his countrymen. If we mistake not, moreover, a certain quality of nervousness had become more or less manifest, even in so solid a specimen of Puritan descent as the gentleman now under discussion. As one of its effects, it bestowed on his countenance a quicker mobility than the old Englishman's had possessed, and keener vivacity, but at the expense of a sturdier something on which these acute endowments seemed to act like dissolving acids. This process, for aught we know, may belong to the great system of human progress, which with every ascending footstep, as it diminishes the necessity for animal force, may be destined gradually to spiritualize us, by refining away our grosser attributes of body. If so, Judge Pyncheon could endure a century or two more of such refinement, as well as most other men. The similarity, intellectual and moral, between the judge and his ancestor appears to have been at least as strong as the resemblance of mien and feature would afford reason to anticipate. In old Colonel Pyncheon's funeral discourse, the clergyman absolutely canonized his deceased parishioner, and opening, as it were, a vista through the roof of the church, and thence through the firmament above, showed him seated, harp in hand, among the crowned choristers of the spiritual world. On his tombstone, too, the record is highly eulogistic, nor does history, so far as he holds a place upon its page, assail the consistency and uprightness of his character. So also, as regards the Judge Pyncheon of today, neither clergyman nor legal critic, nor inscriber of tombstones, nor historian of general or local politics, would venture a word against this eminent person's sincerity as a Christian, or respectability as a man, or integrity as a judge, or courage and faithfulness as the often tried representative of his political party. But besides these cold, formal, and empty words of the chisel that inscribes, the voice that speaks, and the pen that writes, for the public eye and for distant time, and which inevitably lose much of their truth and freedom by the fatal consciousness of doing so, there were traditions about the ancestor, and private diurnal gossip about the judge, remarkably accordant in their testimony. It is often instructive to take the woman's, the private and domestic, view of a public man. Nor can anything be more curious than the vast discrepancy between portraits intended for engraving and the pencil sketches that pass from hand to hand behind the original's back. For example, tradition affirmed that the Puritan had been greedy of wealth. The judge, too, with all the show of liberal expenditure, was said to be as close-fisted as if his gripe were of iron. The ancestor had clothed himself in a grim assumption of kindliness, a rough heartiness of word and manner, which most people took to be the genuine warmth of nature, making its way through the thick and inflexible hide of a manly character. His descendant, in compliance with the requirements of a nicer age, had etherealized this rude benevolence into that broad benignity of smile, wherewith he shone like a noonday sun along the streets, or glowed like a household fire in the drawing-rooms of his private acquaintance. The Puritan, if not belied by some singular stories, murmured even at this day under the narrator's breath, had fallen into certain transgressions to which men of his great animal development, whatever their faith or principles, must continue liable, until they put off impurity along with the gross earthly substance that involves it. We must not stain our page with any contemporary scandal, to a similar purport, that may have been whispered against the judge. The Puritan, again an autocrat in his own household, had worn out 3 wives, and merely by the remorseless weight and hardness of his character in the conjugal relation, had sent them one after another, broken-hearted to their graves. Here the parallel in some sort fails. The judge had wedded but a single wife, and lost her in the 3rd or 4th year of their marriage. There was a fable, however, for such we choose to consider it, though not impossibly, typical of Judge Pyncheon's marital deportment, that the lady got her death-blow in the honeymoon, and never smiled again, because her husband compelled her to serve him with coffee every morning at his bedside, in token of fealty to her liege lord and master. But it is too fruitful a subject, this of hereditary resemblances, the frequent recurrence of which, in a direct line, is truly unaccountable, when we consider how large an accumulation of ancestry lies behind every man at the distance of 1 or 2 centuries. We shall only add, therefore, that the Puritan, so at least says chimney-corner tradition, which often preserves traits of character with marvellous fidelity, was bold, imperious, relentless, crafty, laying his purposes deep and following them out with an inveteracy of pursuit that knew neither rest nor conscience, trampling on the weak, and when essential to his ends, doing his utmost to beat down the strong. Whether the judge in any degree resembled him, the further progress of our narrative may show. Scarcely any of the items in the above-drawn parallel occurred to Phoebe, whose country birth and residence in truth had left her pitifully ignorant of most of the family traditions, which lingered like cobwebs and incrustations of smoke about the rooms and chimney-corners of the house of the Seven Gables. Yet there was a circumstance, very trifling in itself, which impressed her with an odd degree of horror. She had heard of the anathema flung by Maul, the executed wizard, against Colonel Pyncheon and his posterity, that God would give them blood to drink, and likewise of the popular notion that this miraculous blood might now and then be heard gurgling in their throats. The latter scandal, as became a person of sense, and more especially a member of the Pyncheon family, Phoebe had set down for the absurdity which it unquestionably was. But ancient superstitions, after being steeped in human hearts and embodied in human breath, and passing from lip to ear in manifold repetition, through a series of generations, become imbued with an effect of homely truth. The smoke of the domestic hearth has scented them through and through. By long transmission among household facts they grow to look like them, and have such a familiar way of making themselves at home that their influence is usually greater than we suspect. Thus it happened that when Phoebe heard a certain noise in Judge Pyncheon's throat, rather habitual with him, not altogether voluntary, yet indicative of nothing, unless it were a slight bronchial complaint, or, as some people hinted, an apoplectic symptom. When the girl heard this queer and awkward ingurgitation, which the writer never did hear and therefore cannot describe, she very foolishly started and clasped her hands. Of course it was exceedingly ridiculous in Phoebe to be discomposed by such a trifle, and still more unpardonable to show her discomposure to the individual most concerned in it. But the incident chimed in so oddly with her previous fancies about the colonel and the judge that for the moment it seemed quite to mingle their identity. "What is the matter with you, young woman?" said Judge Pyncheon, giving her one of his harsh looks. "Are you afraid of anything?" "Oh, nothing, sir, nothing in the world," answered Phoebe, with a little laugh of vexation at herself. "But perhaps you wish to speak with my cousin Hepzibah. Shall I call her?" "Stay a moment, if you please," said the judge, again beaming sunshine out of his face. "You seem to be a little nervous this morning. The town air, Cousin Phoebe, does not agree with your good wholesome country habits. Or has anything happened to disturb you? Anything remarkable in Cousin Hepzibah's family? An arrival, eh? I thought so. No wonder you are out of sorts, my little cousin. To be an inmate with such a guest may well startle an innocent young girl." "You quite puzzle me, sir," replied Phoebe, gazing inquiringly at the judge. "There is no frightful guest in the house, but only a poor, gentle, childlike man, whom I believe to be Cousin Hepzibah's brother. I am afraid, but you, sir, will know better than I, that he is not quite in his sound senses. But so mild and quiet he seems to be, that a mother might trust her baby with him, and I think he would play with the baby as if he were only a few years older than itself." "He startle me? Oh, no, indeed." "I rejoice to hear so favourable and so ingenious an account of my cousin Clifford," said the benevolent judge. "Many years ago, when we were boys and young men together, I had a great affection for him, and still feel a tender interest in all his concerns. You say, Cousin Phoebe, he appears to be weak-minded. Heaven grant him at least enough of intellect to repent of his past sins." "Nobody, I fancy," observed Phoebe, "can have fewer to repent of." "And is it possible, my dear," rejoined the judge, with a commiserating look, "that you have never heard of Clifford Pyncheon? That you know nothing of his history? Well, it is all right, and your mother has shown a very proper regard for the good name of the family with which she connected herself. Believe the best you can of this unfortunate person, and hope the best. It is a rule which Christians should always follow in their judgments of one another, and especially is it right and wise among near relatives, whose characters have necessarily a degree of mutual dependence. But is Clifford in the parlour? I will just step in and see." "Perhaps, sir, I had better call my cousin Hepzibah," said Phoebe, hardly knowing, however, whether she ought to obstruct the entrance of so affectionate a kinsman into the private regions of the house. "Her brother seemed to be just falling asleep after breakfast, and I am sure she would not like him to be disturbed. Pray, sir, let me give her notice." But the judge showed a singular determination to enter unannounced, and as Phoebe, with the vivacity of a person whose movements unconsciously answer to her thoughts, had stepped towards the door, he used little or no ceremony in putting her aside. "No, no, Miss Phoebe," said Judge Pyncheon, in a voice as deep as a thunder growl, and with a frown as black as the cloud whence it issues. "Stay you here. I know the house, and know my cousin Hepzibah, and know her brother Clifford likewise. Nor need my little country cousin put herself to the trouble of announcing me." In these latter words, by the by, there were symptoms of a change from his sudden harshness into his previous benignity of manner. "I am at home here, Phoebe, you must recollect, and you are the stranger. I will just step in, therefore, and see for myself how Clifford is, and assure him and Hepzibah of my kindly feelings and best wishes. It is right, at this juncture, that they should both hear from my own lips how much I desire to serve them. Ha! Here is Hepzibah herself." Such was the case. The vibrations of the judge's voice had reached the old gentlewoman in the parlour, where she sat with face averted, waiting on her brother's slumber. She now issued forth, as would appear, to defend the entrance, looking, we must needs say, amazingly like the dragon, which in fairy tales is wont to be the guardian over an enchanted beauty. The habitual scowl of her brow was undeniably too fierce at this moment to pass itself off on the innocent score of near-sightedness, and it was bent on Judge Pyncheon in a way that seemed to confound, if not alarm him. So inadequately had he estimated the moral force of a deeply grounded antipathy. She made a repelling gesture with her hand, and stood a perfect picture of prohibition, at full length in the dark frame of the doorway. But we must betray Hepzibah's secret, and confess that the native timorousness of her character even now developed itself in a quick tremor, which to her own perception set each of her joints at variance with its fellows. Possibly the judge was aware how little true hardihood lay behind Hepzibah's formidable front. At any rate, being a gentleman of steady nerves, he soon recovered himself, and failed not to approach his cousin with outstretched hand, adopting the sensible precaution, however, to cover his advance with a smile so broad and sultry that had it been only half as warm as it looked, a trellis of grapes might at once have turned purple under its summer-like exposure. It may have been his purpose, indeed, to melt poor Hepzibah on the spot, as if she were a figure of yellow wax. "Hepzibah, my beloved cousin, I am rejoiced," exclaimed the judge most emphatically. "Now at length you have something to live for. Yes, and all of us, let me say, your friends and kindred, have more to live for than we had yesterday. I have lost no time in hastening to offer any assistance in my power towards making Clifford comfortable. He belongs to us all. I know how much he requires, how much he used to require, with his delicate taste and his love of the beautiful. Anything in my house, pictures, books, wine, luxuries of the table, he may command them all. It would afford me most heartfelt gratification to see him. Shall I step in this moment?" "No," replied Hepzibah, her voice quivering too painfully to allow of many words. "He cannot see visitors." "A visitor, my dear cousin! Do you call me so?" cried the judge, whose sensibility, it seems, was hurt by the coldness of the phrase. "Nay, then, let me be Clifford's host, and your own likewise. Come at once to my house. The country air and all the conveniences, I may say luxuries, that I have gathered about me, will do wonders for him. And you and I, dear Hepzibah, will consult together, and watch together, and labour together to make our dear Clifford happy. Come, why should we make more words about what is both a duty and a pleasure on my part? Come to me at once." On hearing these so hospitable offers and such generous recognition of the claims of kindred, Phoebe felt very much in the mood of running up to Judge Pyncheon and giving him, of her own accord, the kiss from which she had so recently shrunk away. It was quite otherwise with Hepzibah. The judge's smile seemed to operate on her acerbity of heart like sunshine upon vinegar, making it 10 times sourer than ever. "Clifford," said she, still too agitated to utter more than an abrupt sentence, "Clifford has a home here." "May Heaven forgive you, Hepzibah," said Judge Pyncheon, reverently lifting his eyes towards that high court of equity to which he appealed, "if you suffer any ancient prejudice or animosity to weigh with you in this matter. I stand here with an open heart, willing and anxious to receive yourself and Clifford into it. Do not refuse my good offices, my earnest propositions for your welfare. They are such in all respects as it behooves your nearest kinsman to make. It will be a heavy responsibility, cousin, if you confine your brother to this dismal house and stifled air, when the delightful freedom of my country seat is at his command." "It would never suit Clifford," said Hepzibah as briefly as before. "Woman!" broke forth the judge, giving way to his resentment, "what is the meaning of all this? Have you other resources? Nay, I suspected as much. Take care, Hepzibah, take care. Clifford is on the brink of as black a ruin as ever befell him yet. But why do I talk with you, woman as you are? Make way, I must see Clifford." Hepzibah spread out her gaunt figure across the door, and seemed really to increase in bulk, looking the more terrible also because there was so much terror and agitation in her heart. But Judge Pyncheon's evident purpose of forcing a passage was interrupted by a voice from the inner room, a weak, tremulous, wailing voice, indicating helpless alarm, with no more energy for self-defense than belongs to a frightened infant. "Hepzibah! Hepzibah!" cried the voice. "Go down on your knees to him, kiss his feet, entreat him not to come in. Oh, let him have mercy on me! Mercy! Mercy!" For the instant it appeared doubtful whether it were not the judge's resolute purpose to set Hepzibah aside, and step across the threshold into the parlour, whence issued that broken and miserable murmur of entreaty. It was not pity that restrained him, for at the first sound of the enfeebled voice a red fire kindled in his eyes, and he made a quick pace forward, with something inexpressibly fierce and grim darkening forth, as it were, out of the whole man. To know Judge Pyncheon was to see him at that moment. After such a revelation, let him smile with what sultriness he would, he could much sooner turn grapes purple or pumpkins yellow than melt the iron-branded impression out of the beholder's memory. And it rendered his aspect not the less, but more frightful, that it seemed not to express wrath or hatred, but a certain hot fellness of purpose, which annihilated everything but itself. Yet after all, are we not slandering an excellent and amiable man? Look at the judge now. He is apparently conscious of having erred in too energetically pressing his deeds of loving kindness on persons unable to appreciate them. He will await their better mood, and hold himself as ready to assist them then as at this moment. As he draws back from the door, an all-comprehensive benignity blazes from his visage, indicating that he gathers Hepzibah, little Phoebe, and the invisible Clifford, all three together with the whole world besides, into his immense heart, and gives them a warm bath in its flood of affection. "You do me great wrong, dear cousin Hepzibah," said he, first kindly offering his hand, and then drawing on his glove preparatory to departure. "Very great wrong, but I forgive it, and will study to make you think better of me. Of course our poor Clifford being in so unhappy a state of mind, I cannot think of urging an interview at present. But I shall watch over his welfare as if he were my own beloved brother, nor do I at all despair, my dear cousin, of constraining both him and you to acknowledge your injustice. When that shall happen, I desire no other revenge than your acceptance of the best offices in my power to do you." With a bow to Hepzibah, and a degree of paternal benevolence in his parting nod to Phoebe, the judge left the shop, and went smiling along the street. As is customary with the rich, when they aim at the honours of a republic, he apologized, as it were, to the people for his wealth, prosperity, and elevated station, by a free and hearty manner towards those who knew him, putting off the more of his dignity in due proportion with the humbleness of the man whom he saluted, and thereby proving a haughty consciousness of his advantages as irrefragably as if he had marched forth preceded by a troop of lackeys to clear the way. On this particular forenoon, so excessive was the warmth of Judge Pyncheon's kindly aspect, that, such at least was the rumour about town, an extra passage of the water-carts was found essential, in order to lay the dust occasioned by so much extra sunshine. No sooner had he disappeared than Hepzibah grew deadly white, and staggering towards Phoebe, let her head fall on the young girl's shoulder. "Oh, Phoebe," murmured she, "that man has been the horror of my life. Shall I never, never have the courage, will my voice never cease from trembling long enough to let me tell him what he is?" "Is he so very wicked?" asked Phoebe. "Yet his offers were surely kind." "Do not speak of them. He has a heart of iron," rejoined Hepzibah. "Go now and talk to Clifford. Amuse and keep him quiet. It would disturb him wretchedly to see me so agitated as I am. There, go, dear child, and I will try to look after the shop." Phoebe went accordingly, but perplexed herself meanwhile with queries as to the purport of the scene which she had just witnessed, and also whether judges, clergymen, and other characters of that eminent stamp and respectability could really in any single instance be otherwise than just and upright men. A doubt of this nature has a most disturbing influence, and if shown to be a fact, comes with fearful and startling effect on minds of the trim, orderly, and limit-loving class in which we find our little country girl. Dispositions more boldly speculative may derive a stern enjoyment from the discovery, since there must be evil in the world, that a high man is as likely to grasp his share of it as a low one. A wider scope of view and a deeper insight may see rank, dignity, and station all proved illusory, so far as regards their claim to human reverence, and yet not feel as if the universe were thereby tumbled headlong into chaos. But Phoebe, in order to keep the universe in its old place, was fain to smother, in some degree, her own intuitions as to Judge Pyncheon's character. And as for her cousin's testimony in disparagement of it, she concluded that Hepzibah's judgment was embittered by one of those family feuds which render hatred the more deadly by the dead and corrupted love that they intermingle with its native poison. End of Chapter 8 of The House of Seven Gables by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Read by Nicodemus.
Chapter 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 9 of The House of the Seven Gables by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Read by Nicodemus. Clifford and Phoebe. Truly was there something high, generous, and noble in the native composition of our poor old Hepzibah, or else, and it was quite as probably the case, she had been enriched by poverty, developed by sorrow, elevated by the strong and solitary affection of her life, and thus endowed with heroism, which never could have characterized her in what are called happier circumstances. Through dreary years Hepzibah had looked forward, for the most part despairingly, never with any confidence of hope, but always with the feeling that it was her brightest possibility, to the very position in which she now found herself. In her own behalf, she had asked nothing of Providence but the opportunity of devoting herself to this brother, whom she had so loved, so admired for what he was or might have been, and to whom she had kept her faith, alone of all the world, wholly, unfalteringly, at every instant, and throughout life. And here, in his late decline, the lost one had come back out of his long and strange misfortune, and was thrown on her sympathy, as it seemed, not merely for the bread of his physical existence, but for everything that should keep him morally alive. She had responded to the call. She had come forward, our poor gaunt Hepzibah, in her rusty silks, with her rigid joints, and the sad perversity of her scowl, ready to do her utmost, and with affection enough, if that were all, to do 100 times as much. There could be few more tearful sights, and heaven forgive us if a smile insist on mingling with our conception of it, few sights with truer pathos in them, than Hepzibah presented on that first afternoon. How patiently did she endeavor to wrap Clifford up in her great warm love, and make it all the world to him, so that he should retain no torturing sense of the coldness and dreariness without. Her little efforts to amuse him, how pitiful, yet magnanimous they were. Remembering his early love of poetry and fiction, she unlocked a bookcase, and took down several books that had been excellent reading in their day. There was a volume of Pope, with The Rape of the Lock in it, and another of the Tatler, and an odd one of Dryden's Miscellanies, all with tarnished gilding on their covers, and thoughts of tarnished brilliancy inside. They had no success with Clifford. These and all such writers of society, whose new works glow like the rich texture of a just-woven carpet, must be content to relinquish their charm, for every reader, after an age or two, and could hardly be supposed to retain any portion of it for a mind that had utterly lost its estimate of modes and manners. Hepzibah then took up Rasselas, and began to read of the Happy Valley, with the vague idea that some secret of a contented life had there been elaborated, which might at least serve Clifford and herself for this one day. But the Happy Valley had a cloud over it. Hepzibah troubled her auditor, moreover, by innumerable sins of emphasis, which she seemed to defect without any reference to the meaning. Nor, in fact, did he appear to take much note of the sense of what she read, but evidently felt the tedium of the lecture, without harvesting its profit. His sister's voice, too, naturally harsh, had in the cause of her sorrowful lifetime contracted a kind of croak, which, when it once gets into the human throat, is as ineradicable as sin. In both sexes, occasionally, this lifelong croak, accompanying each word of joy or sorrow, is one of the symptoms of a settled melancholy, and wherever it occurs, the whole history of misfortune is conveyed in its slightest accent. The effect is as if the voice had been dyed black, or, if we must use a more moderate simile, this miserable croak running through all the variations of the voice is like a black silken thread, on which the crystal beads of speech are strung, and whence they take their hue. Such voices have put on mourning for dead hopes, and they ought to die and be buried along with them. Discerning that Clifford was not gladdened by her efforts, Hepzibah searched about the house for the means of more exhilarating pastime. At one time her eyes chanced to rest on Alice Pyncheon's harpsichord. It was a moment of great peril, for despite the traditionary awe that had gathered over this instrument of music, and the dirges which spiritual fingers were said to play on it, the devoted sister had solemn thoughts of thrumming on its chords for Clifford's benefit, and accompanying the performance with her voice. Poor Clifford! Poor Hepzibah! Poor harpsichord! All three would have been miserable together. By some good agency, possibly by the unrecognized interposition of the long-buried Alice herself, the threatening calamity was averted. But the worst of all, the hardest stroke of fate for Hepzibah to endure, and perhaps for Clifford too, was his invincible distaste for her appearance. Her features, never the most agreeable, and now harsh with age and grief, and resentment against the world for his sake. Her dress, and especially her turban, the queer and quaint manners which had unconsciously grown upon her in solitude, such being the poor gentlewoman's outward characteristics, it is no great marvel, although the mournfulest of pities, that the instinctive lover of the beautiful was fain to turn away his eyes. There was no help for it. It would be the latest impulse to die within him. In his last extremity, the expiring breath stealing faintly through Clifford's lips, he would doubtless press Hepzibah's hand in fervent recognition of all her lavished love, and close his eyes, but not so much to die, as to be constrained to look no longer on her face. Poor Hepzibah! She took counsel with herself what might be done, and thought of putting ribbons in her turban, but by the instant rush of several guardian angels was withheld from an experiment that could hardly have proved less than fatal to the beloved object of her anxiety. To be brief, besides Hepzibah's disadvantages of person, there was an uncouthness pervading all her deeds, a clumsy something that could but ill adapt itself for use, and not at all for ornament. She was a grief to Clifford, and she knew it. In this extremity, the antiquated virgin turned to Phoebe. No grovelling jealousy was in her heart. Had it pleased heaven to crown the heroic fidelity of her life by making her personally the medium of Clifford's happiness, it would have rewarded her for all the past, by a joy with no bright tints, indeed, but deep and true, and worth 1,000 gayer ecstasies. This could not be. She therefore turned to Phoebe, and resigned the task into the young girl's hands. The latter took it up cheerfully, as she did everything, but with no sense of a mission to perform, and succeeding all the better for that same simplicity. By the involuntary effect of a genial temperament, Phoebe soon grew to be absolutely essential to the daily comfort, if not the daily life, of her two forlorn companions. The grime and sordidness of the house of the Seven Gables seemed to have vanished since her appearance there. The gnawing tooth of the dry rot was stayed among the old timbers of its skeleton frame. The dust had ceased to settle down so densely, from the antique ceilings, upon the floors and furniture of the rooms below. Or at any rate, there was a little housewife, as light-footed as the breeze that sweeps a garden walk, gliding hither and thither to brush it all away. The shadows of gloomy events that haunted the else lonely and desolate apartments the heavy, breathless scent which death had left in more than one of the bedchambers, ever since his visits of long ago. These were less powerful than the purifying influence scattered throughout the atmosphere of the household by the presence of one youthful, fresh, and thoroughly wholesome heart. There was no morbidness in Phoebe. If there had been, the old Pyncheon house was the very locality to ripen it into incurable disease. But now her spirit resembled, in its potency, a minute quantity of ottar of rose in one of Hepzibah's huge, iron-bound trunks, diffusing its fragrance through the various articles of linen and wrought lace, kerchiefs, caps, stockings, folded dresses, gloves, and whatever else was treasured there. As every article in the great trunk was the sweeter for the rose scent, so did all the thoughts and emotions of Hepzibah and Clifford, sombre as they might seem, acquire a subtle attribute of happiness from Phoebe's intermixture with them. Her activity of body, intellect, and heart impelled her continually to perform the ordinary little toils that offered themselves around her, and to think the thought proper for the moment, and to sympathize, now with the twittering gaiety of the robins in the pear-tree, and now to such a depth as she could with Hepzibah's dark anxiety, or the vague moan of her brother. This facile adaptation was at once the symptom of perfect health and its best preservative. A nature like Phoebe's has invariably its due influence, but is seldom regarded with due honor. Its spiritual force, however, may be partially estimated by the fact of her having found a place for herself, amid circumstances so stern as those which surrounded the mistress of the house, and also by the effect which she produced on a character of so much more mass than her own. For the gaunt, bony frame and limbs of Hepzibah, as compared with the tiny lithesomeness of Phoebe's figure, were perhaps in some fit proportion with the moral weight and substance, respectively, of the woman and the girl. To the guest, to Hepzibah's brother, or cousin Clifford, as Phoebe now began to call him, she was especially necessary. Not that he could ever be said to converse with her, or often manifest in any other very definite mode his sense of a charm in her society. But if she were a long while absent, he became pettish and nervously restless, pacing the room to and fro with the uncertainty that characterized all his movements, or else would sit broodingly in his great chair, resting his head on his hands, and evincing life only by an electric sparkle of ill humour whenever Hepzibah endeavoured to arouse him. Phoebe's presence, and the contiguity of her fresh life to his blighted one, was usually all that he required. Indeed, such was the native gush and play of her spirit, that she was seldom perfectly quiet and undemonstrative, any more than a fountain ever ceases to dimple and warble with its flow. She possessed the gift of song, and that too so naturally that you would as little think of inquiring whence she had caught it, or what master had taught her, as of asking the same questions about a bird, in whose small strain of music we recognize the voice of the Creator as distinctly as in the loudest accents of his thunder. So long as Phoebe sang, she might stray at her own will about the house. Clifford was content whether the sweet airy homeliness of her tones came down from the upper chambers, or along the passageway from the shop, or was sprinkled through the foliage of the pear-tree inward from the garden with the twinkling sunbeams. He would sit quietly with the gentle pleasure gleaming over his face, brighter now, and now a little dimmer, as the song happened to float near him, or was more remotely heard. It pleased him best, however, when she sat on a low footstool at his knee. It is perhaps remarkable, considering her temperament, that Phoebe oftener chose a strain of pathos than of gaiety. But the young and happy are not ill-pleased to temper their life with a transparent shadow. The deepest pathos of Phoebe's voice and song, moreover, came sifted through the golden texture of a cheery spirit, and was somehow so interfused with the quality thence acquired, that one's heart felt all the lighter for having wept at it. Broad mirth in the sacred presence of dark misfortune would have jarred harshly and irreverently with the solemn symphony that rolled its undertone through Hepzibah's and her brother's life. Therefore it was well that Phoebe so often chose sad themes, and not amiss that they ceased to be so sad while she was singing them. Becoming habituated to her companionship, Clifford readily showed how capable of imbibing pleasant tints and gleams of cheerful light from all quarters his nature must originally have been. He grew youthful while she sat by him. A beauty not precisely real, even in its utmost manifestation, and which a painter would have watched long to seize and fix upon his canvas, and after all in vain. Beauty, nevertheless, that was not a mere dream, would sometimes play upon and illuminate his face. It did more than to illuminate. It transfigured him with an expression that could only be interpreted as the glow of an exquisite and happy spirit. That grey hair and those furrows, with their record of infinite sorrow so deeply written across his brow, and so compressed as with a futile effort to crowd in all the tale, that the whole inscription was made illegible. These, for the moment, vanished. An eye at once tender and acute might have beheld in the man some shadow of what he was meant to be. Anon, as age came stealing, like a sad twilight, back over his figure, you would have felt tempted to hold an argument with destiny, and affirm that either this being should not have been made mortal, or mortal existence should have been tempered to his qualities. There seemed no necessity for his having drawn breath at all. The world never wanted him, but as he had breathed, it ought always to have been the balmiest of summer air. The same perplexity will invariably haunt us with regard to natures that tend to feed excessively upon the beautiful, let their earthly fate be as lenient as it may. Phoebe, it is probable, had but a very imperfect comprehension of the character over which she had thrown so beneficent a spell. Nor was it necessary. The fire upon the hearth can gladden a whole semicircle of faces round about it, but need not know the individuality of one among them all. Indeed, there was something too fine and delicate in Clifford's traits to be perfectly appreciated by one whose sphere lay so much in the actual as Phoebe's did. For Clifford, however, the reality and simplicity and thorough homeliness of the girl's nature were as powerful a charm as any that she possessed. Beauty, it is true, and beauty almost perfect in its own style, was indispensable. Had Phoebe been coarse in feature, shaped clumsily, of a harsh voice, and uncouthly mannered, she might have been rich with all good gifts beneath this unfortunate exterior, and still, so long as she wore the guise of woman, she would have shocked Clifford and depressed him by her lack of beauty. But nothing more beautiful, nothing prettier at least, was ever made than Phoebe. And therefore, to this man, whose whole poor and impalpable enjoyment of existence heretofore, and until both his heart and fancy died within him, had been a dream, whose images of women had more and more lost their warmth and substance, and been frozen, like the pictures of secluded artists, into the chillest ideality, to him this little figure of the cheeriest household life was just what he required to bring him back into the breathing world. Persons who have wandered or been expelled out of the common track of things, even were it for a better system, desire nothing so much as to be led back. They shiver in their loneliness, be it on a mountain top or in a dungeon. Now Phoebe's presence made a home about her, that very sphere which the outcast, the prisoner, the potentate, the wretch beneath mankind, the wretch aside from it, or the wretch above it, instinctively pines after. A home. She was real. Holding her hand, you felt something, a tender something, a substance and a warm one, and so long as you should feel its grasp, soft as it was, you might be certain that your place was good in the whole sympathetic chain of human nature. The world was no longer a delusion. By looking a little further in this direction, we might suggest an explanation of an often suggested mystery. Why are poets so apt to choose their mates, not for any similarity of poetic endowment, but for qualities which might make the happiness of the rudest handicraftsman as well as that of the ideal craftsman of the spirit? Because probably, at his highest elevation, the poet needs no human intercourse, but he finds it dreary to descend and be a stranger. There was something very beautiful in the relation that grew up between this pair, so closely and constantly linked together, yet with such a waste of gloomy and mysterious years from his birth to hers. On Clifford's part, it was the feeling of a man naturally endowed with the liveliest sensibility to feminine influence, but who had never quaffed the cup of passionate love, and knew that it was now too late. He knew it with the instinctive delicacy that had survived his intellectual decay. Thus, his sentiment for Phoebe, without being paternal, was not less chaste than if she had been his daughter. He was a man, it is true, and recognized her as a woman. She was his only representative of womankind. He took unfailing note of every charm that appertained to her sex, and saw the ripeness of her lips and the virginal development of her bosom. All her little womanly ways, budding out of her like blossoms on a young fruit tree, had their effect on him, and sometimes caused his very heart to tingle with the keenest thrills of pleasure. At such moments, for the effect was seldom more than momentary, the half-torpid man would be full of harmonious life, just as a long silent harp is full of sound when the musician's fingers sweep across it. But after all, it seemed rather a perception or a sympathy than a sentiment belonging to himself as an individual. He read Phoebe as he would a sweet and simple story. He listened to her as if she were a verse of household poetry, which God, in requital of his bleak and dismal lot, had permitted some angel, that most pitied him, to warble through the house. She was not an actual fact for him, but the interpretation of all that he lacked on earth brought warmly home to his conception, so that this mere symbol, or life-like picture, had almost the comfort of reality. But we strive in vain to put the idea into words. No adequate expression of the beauty and profound pathos with which it impresses us is attainable. This being made only for happiness, and heretofore so miserably failing to be happy, his tendencies so hideously thwarted, that some unknown time ago, the delicate spring of his character, never morally or intellectually strong, had given way, and he was now imbecile. This poor, forlorn voyager from the islands of the blest, in a frail bark, on a tempestuous sea, had been flung by the last mountain wave of his shipwreck into a quiet harbor. There, as he lay more than half lifeless on the strand, the fragrance of an earthly rosebud had come to his nostrils, and as odors will, had summoned up reminiscences or visions of all the living and breathing beauty amid which he should have had his home. With his native susceptibility of happy influences, he inhales the slight, ethereal rapture into his soul, and expires. And how did Phoebe regard Clifford? The girl's was not one of those natures which are most attracted by what is strange and exceptional in human character. The path which would best have suited her was the well-worn track of ordinary life. The companions in whom she would most have delighted were such as one encounters at every turn. The mystery which enveloped Clifford, so far as it affected her at all, was an annoyance, rather than the piquant charm which many women might have found in it. Still, her native kindliness was brought strongly into play, not by what was darkly picturesque in his situation, nor so much even by the finer graces of his character, as by the simple appeal of a heart so forlorn as his to one so full of genuine sympathy as hers. She gave him an affectionate regard, because he needed so much love, and seemed to have received so little. With a ready tact, the result of ever active and wholesome sensibility, she discerned what was good for him, and did it. Whatever was morbid in his mind and experience she ignored, and thereby kept their intercourse healthy, by the incautious, but as it were heaven-directed freedom of her whole conduct. The sick in mind, and perhaps in body, are rendered more darkly and hopelessly so by the manifold reflection of their disease, mirrored back from all quarters in the deportment of those about them. They are compelled to inhale the poison of their own breath, in infinite repetition. But Phoebe afforded her poor patient a supply of purer air. She impregnated it, too, not with the wildflower scent, for wildness was no trait of hers, but with the perfume of garden roses, pinks, and other blossoms of much sweetness, which nature and man have consented together in making grow from summer to summer, and from century to century. Such a flower was Phoebe in her relation with Clifford, and such the delight that he inhaled from her. Yet it must be said, her petals sometimes drooped a little, in consequence of the heavy atmosphere about her. She grew more thoughtful than heretofore. Looking aside at Clifford's face, and seeing the dim, unsatisfactory elegance, and the intellect almost quenched, she would try to inquire what had been his life. Was he always thus? Had this veil been over him from his birth? This veil under which far more of his spirit was hidden than revealed, and through which he so imperfectly discerned the actual world? Or was its grey texture woven of some dark calamity? Phoebe loved no riddles, and would have been glad to escape the perplexity of this one. Nevertheless, there was so far a good result of her meditations on Clifford's character, that when her involuntary conjectures, together with the tendency of every strange circumstance to tell its own story, had gradually taught her the fact, it had no terrible effect upon her. Let the world have done him what vast wrong it might, she knew cousin Clifford too well, or fancied so, ever to shudder at the touch of his thin, delicate fingers. Within a few days after the appearance of this remarkable inmate, the routine of life had established itself with a good deal of uniformity in the old house of our narrative. In the morning, very shortly after breakfast, it was Clifford's custom to fall asleep in his chair, nor, unless accidentally disturbed, would he emerge from a dense cloud of slumber, or the thinner mists that flitted to and fro, until well towards noonday. These hours of drowsihead were the season of the old gentlewoman's attendance on her brother, while Phoebe took charge of the shop, an arrangement which the public speedily understood, and evinced their decided preference of the younger shopwoman by the multiplicity of their calls during her administration of affairs. Dinner over, Hepzibah took her knitting work, a long stocking of grey yarn, for her brother's winter wear, and with a sigh and a scowl of affectionate farewell to Clifford, and a gesture enjoining watchfulness on Phoebe, went to take her seat behind the counter. It was now the young girl's turn to be the nurse, the guardian, the playmate, or whatever is the fitter phrase of the grey-haired man. End of Chapter 9 of The House of the Seven Gables, by Nathaniel Hawthorne, read by Nicodemus. Chapter 10. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 10 of The House of the Seven Gables, by Nathaniel Hawthorne, read by Nicodemus. The Pyncheon Garden. Clifford, except for Phoebe's more active instigation, would ordinarily have yielded to the torpor which had crept through all his modes of being, and which sluggishly counselled him to sit in his morning chair till eventide. But the girl seldom failed to propose a removal to the garden, where Uncle Venner and the daguerreotypist had made such repairs on the roof of the ruinous arbour or summer-house, that it was now a sufficient shelter from sunshine and casual showers. The hop-vine, too, had begun to grow luxuriantly over the sides of the little edifice, and made an interior of verdant seclusion, with innumerable peeps and glimpses into the wider solitude of the garden. Here, sometimes in this green play-place of flickering light, Phoebe read to Clifford. Her acquaintance, the artist, who appeared to have a literary turn, had supplied her with works of fiction, in pamphlet form, and a few volumes of poetry, in altogether a different style and taste from those which Hepzibah selected for his amusement. Small thanks were due to the books, however, if the girl's readings were in any degree more successful than her elderly cousin's. Phoebe's voice had always a pretty music in it, and could either enliven Clifford by its sparkle and gaiety of tone, or soothe him by a continued flow of pebbly and brook-like cadences. But the fictions in which the country girl, unused to works of that nature, often became deeply absorbed, interested her strange auditor very little, or not at all. Pictures of life, scenes of passion or sentiment, wit, humour, and pathos were all thrown away, or worse than thrown away, on Clifford, either because he lacked an experience by which to test their truth, or because his own griefs were a touchstone of reality that few feigned emotions could withstand. When Phoebe broke into a peal of merry laughter at what she read, he would now and then laugh for sympathy, but oftener respond with a troubled, questioning look. If a tear, a maiden's sunshiny tear over imaginary woe, dropped upon some melancholy page, Clifford either took it as a token of actual calamity, or else grew peevish, and angrily motioned her to close the volume. And wisely, too. Is not the world sad enough, in genuine earnest, without making a pastime of mock sorrows? With poetry it was rather better. He delighted in the swell and subsidence of the rhythm, and the happily recurring rhyme. Nor was Clifford incapable of feeling the sentiment of poetry, not, perhaps, where it was highest or deepest, but where it was most flitting and ethereal. It was impossible to foretell in what exquisite verse the awakening spell might lurk, but on raising her eyes from the page to Clifford's face, Phoebe would be made aware, by the light breaking through it, that a more delicate intelligence than her own had caught a lambent flame from what she read. One glow of this kind, however, was often the precursor of gloom for many hours afterward, because when the glow left him, he seemed conscious of a missing sense and power, and groped about for them, as if a blind man should go seeking his lost eyesight. It pleased him more, and was better for his inward welfare, that Phoebe should talk, and make passing occurrences vivid to his mind by her accompanying description and remarks. The life of the garden offered topics enough for such discourse as suited Clifford best. He never failed to inquire what flowers had bloomed since yesterday. His feelings for flowers was very exquisite, and seemed not so much a taste as an emotion. He was fond of sitting with one in his hand, intently observing it, and looking from its petals into Phoebe's face, as if the garden flower were the sister of the household maiden. Not merely was there a delight in the flower's perfume, or pleasure in its beautiful form, and the delicacy or brightness of its hue, but Clifford's enjoyment was accompanied with the perception of life, character, and individuality that made him love these blossoms of the garden, as if they were endowed with sentiment and intelligence. This affection and sympathy for flowers is almost exclusively a woman's trait. Men, if endowed with it by nature, soon lose, forget, and learn to despise it in their contact with coarser things than flowers. Clifford, too, had long forgotten it, but found it again now, as he slowly revived from the chill torpor of his life. It is wonderful how many pleasant incidents continually come to pass in that secluded garden spot when once Phoebe had set herself to look for them. She had seen or heard a bee there on the first day of her acquaintance with the place, and often, almost continually indeed, since then, the bees kept coming thither, heaven knows why, or by what pertinacious desire, for far-fetched sweets, when no doubt there were broad clover fields and all kinds of garden growth much nearer home than this. Thither the bees came, however, and plunged into the squash blossoms, as if there were no other squash vines within a long day's flight, or as if the soil of Hephzibah's garden gave its productions just the very quality which these laborious little wizards wanted, in order to impart the hymettus odor to their whole hive of New England honey. When Clifford heard their sunny buzzing murmur in the heart of the great yellow blossoms, he looked about him with a joyful sense of warmth and blue sky, and green grass, and of God's free air in the whole height from earth to heaven. After all, there need be no question why the bees came to that one green nook in the dusty town. God sent them thither to gladden our poor Clifford, they brought the rich summer with them, in requital of a little honey. When the bean vines began to flower on the poles, there was one particular variety which bore a vivid scarlet blossom. The daguerreotypist had found these beans in a garret, over one of the Seven Gables, treasured up in an old chest of drawers by some horticultural Pyncheon of days gone by, who doubtless meant to sow them the next summer, but was himself first sown in Death's garden ground. By way of testing whether there were still a living germ in such ancient seeds, Holgrave had planted some of them, and the result of his experiment was a splendid row of bean vines, clambering early to the full height of the poles, and arraying them from top to bottom in a spiral profusion of red blossoms. And ever since the unfolding first bud, a multitude of hummingbirds had been attracted thither. At times it seemed as if for every one of the 100 blossoms there was one of these tiniest fowls of the air, a thumb's bigness of burnished plumage, hovering and vibrating about the bean-poles. It was with indescribable interest, and even more than childish delight, that Clifford watched the hummingbirds. He used to thrust his head softly out of the arbor to see them the better, all the while, too, motioning Phoebe to be quiet, and snatching glimpses of the smile upon her face, so as to heap his enjoyment up the higher with her sympathy. He had not merely grown young, he was a child again. Hepzibah, whenever she happened to witness one of these fits of miniature enthusiasm, would shake her head with a strange mingling of the mother and sister, and of pleasure and sadness in her aspect. She said that it had always been thus with Clifford when the hummingbirds came, always from his babyhood, and that his delight in them had been one of the earliest tokens by which he showed his love for beautiful things. And it was a wonderful coincidence, the good lady thought, that the artist should have planted these scarlet flowering beans, which the hummingbird sought far and wide, and which had not grown in the Pyncheon garden before for 40 years, on the very summer of Clifford's return. Then would the tears stand in poor Hepzibah's eyes, or overflow them with a too abundant gush, so that she was fain to betake herself into some corner, lest Clifford should espy her agitation. Indeed, all the enjoyments of this period were provocative of tears. Coming so late as it did, it was a kind of Indian summer, with the mist in its balmiest sunshine, and decay and death in its gaudiest delight. The more Clifford seemed to taste the happiness of a child, the sadder was the difference to be recognized. With the mysterious and terrible past, which had annihilated his memory, and a blank future before him, he had only this visionary and impalpable now, which, if you once look closely at it, is nothing. He himself, as was perceptible by many symptoms, lay darkly behind his pleasure, and knew it to be a baby play, which he was to toy and trifle with, instead of thoroughly believing. Clifford saw, it may be, in the mirror of his deeper consciousness, that he was an example and representative of that great class of people whom an inexplicable providence is continually putting at cross purposes with the world, breaking what seems its own promise in their nature, withholding their proper food, and setting poison before them for a banquet, and thus, when it might so easily, as one would think, have been adjusted otherwise, making their existence a strangeness, a solitude, and torment. All his life long he had been learning how to be wretched, as one learns a foreign tongue, and now, with the lesson thoroughly by heart, he could with difficulty comprehend his little airy happiness. Frequently there was a dim shadow of doubt in his eyes. "Take my hand, Phoebe," he would say, "and pinch it hard with your little fingers. Give me a rose, that I may press its thorns, and prove myself awake by the sharp touch of pain." Evidently he desired this prick of a trifling anguish, in order to assure himself, by that quality which he best knew to be real, that the garden and the 7 weather-beaten gables, and Hepzibah's scowl, and Phoebe's smile, were real likewise. Without this signet in his flesh, he could have attributed no more substance to them than to the empty confusion of imaginary scenes with which he had fed his spirit, until even that poor sustenance was exhausted. The author needs great faith in his reader's sympathy, else he must hesitate to give details so minute, and incidents apparently so trifling, as are essential to make up the idea of this garden life. It was the Eden of a thunder-smitten Adam, who had fled for refuge thither out of the same dreary and perilous wilderness into which the original Adam was expelled. One of the available means of amusement, of which Phoebe made the most in Clifford's behalf, was that feathered society, the hens, a breed of whom, as we have already said, was an immemorial heirloom in the Pyncheon family. In compliance with the whim of Clifford, as it troubled him to see them in confinement, they had been set at liberty, and now roamed at will about the garden, doing some little mischief, but hindered from escape by buildings on 3 sides and the difficult peaks of a wooden fence on the other. They spent much of their abundant leisure on the margin of Maule's well, which was haunted by a kind of snail, evidently a titbit to their palates, and the brackish water itself, however nauseous to the rest of the world, was so greatly esteemed by these fowls that they might be seen tasting, turning up their heads and smacking their bills with precisely the air of wine-bibbers round a probationary cask. Their generally quiet, yet often brisk and constantly diversified talk, one to another, or sometimes in soliloquy, as they scratched worms out of the rich black soil, or pecked at such plants as suited their taste, had such a domestic tone that it was almost a wonder why you could not establish a regular interchange of ideas about household matters, human and gallinaceous. All hens are well worth studying for the piquancy and rich variety of their manners, but by no possibility can there have been other fowls of such odd appearance and deportment as these ancestral ones. They probably embodied the traditionary peculiarities of their whole line of progenitors, derived through an unbroken succession of eggs, or else this individual Chanticleer and his 2 wives had grown to be humorists, and a little crack-brained withal, on account of their solitary way of life, and out of sympathy for Hepzibah, their lady patroness. Queer indeed they looked. Chanticleer himself, though stalking on 2 stilt-like legs, with the dignity of interminable descent in all his gestures, was hardly bigger than an ordinary partridge. His 2 wives were about the size of quails, and as for the one chicken, it looked small enough to be still in the egg, and at the same time sufficiently old, withered, wizened, and experienced to have been founder of the antiquated race. Instead of being the youngest of the family, it rather seemed to have aggregated itself into the ages, not only of these living specimens of the breed, but of all its forefathers and foremothers, whose united excellences and oddities were squeezed into its little body. Its mother evidently regarded it as the one chicken of the world, and as necessary, in fact, to the world's continuance, or at any rate, to the equilibrium of the present system of affairs, whether in church or state. No lesser sense of the infant fowl's importance could have justified, even in a mother's eyes, the perseverance with which she watched over its safety, ruffling her small person to twice its proper size, and flying in everybody's face that so much as looked towards her hopeful progeny. No lower estimate could have vindicated the indefatigable zeal with which she scratched, and her unscrupulousness in digging up the choicest flower or vegetable, for the sake of the fat earthworm at its root. Her nervous cluck when the chicken happened to be hidden in the long grass or under the squash leaves, her gentle croak of satisfaction while sure of it beneath her wing, her note of ill-concealed fear and obstreperous defiance when she saw her arch-enemy, a neighbor's cat, on the top of the high fence. One or the other of these sounds was to be heard at almost every moment of the day. By degrees, the observer came to feel nearly as much interest in this chicken of illustrious race as the mother hen did. Phoebe, after getting well acquainted with the old hen, was sometimes permitted to take the chicken in her hand, which was quite capable of grasping its cubic inch or 2 of body. While she curiously examined its hereditary marks, the peculiar speckle of its plumage, the funny tuft on its head, and a knob on each of its legs, the little biped, as she insisted, kept giving her a sagacious wink. The daguerreotypist once whispered her that these marks betokened the oddities of the Pyncheon family, and that the chicken itself was a symbol of the life of the old house, embodying its interpretation likewise, although an unintelligible one, as such clues generally are. It was a feathered riddle, a mystery hatched out of an egg, and just as mysterious as if the egg had been addle. The second of Chanticleer's 2 wives, ever since Phoebe's arrival, had been in a state of heavy despondency, caused, as it afterwards appeared, by her inability to lay an egg. One day, however, by her self-important gait, the sideways turn of her head, and the cock of her eye, as she pried into one and another nook of the garden, croaking to herself all the while with inexpressible complacency, it was made evident that this identical hen, much as mankind undervalued her, carried something about her person, the worth of which was not to be estimated either in gold or precious stones. Shortly after, there was a prodigious cackling and a gratulation of Chanticleer and all his family, including the wizened chicken, who appeared to understand the matter quite as well as did his sire, his mother, or his aunt. That afternoon Phoebe found a diminutive egg, not in the regular nest, it was far too precious to be trusted there, but cunningly hidden under the currant bushes, on some dry stalks of last year's grass. Hepzibah, on learning the fact, took possession of the egg and appropriated it to Clifford's breakfast, on account of a certain delicacy of flavor, for which, as she affirmed, these eggs had always been famous. Thus unscrupulously did the old gentlewoman sacrifice the continuance, perhaps, of an ancient feathered race, with no better end than to supply her brother with a dainty that hardly filled the bowl of a teaspoon. It must have been in reference to this outrage that Chanticleer, the next day, accompanied by the bereaved mother of the egg, took his post in front of Phoebe and Clifford, and delivered himself of a harangue that might have proved as long as his own pedigree, but for a fit of merriment on Phoebe's part. Hereupon the offended fowl stalked away on his long stilts, and utterly withdrew his notice from Phoebe and the rest of human nature, until she made her peace with an offering of spice cake, which, next to snails, was the delicacy most in favour with his aristocratic taste. We linger too long, no doubt, beside this paltry rivulet of life that flowed through the garden of the Pyncheon house. But we deem it pardonable to record these mean incidents and poor delights, because they proved so greatly to Clifford's benefit. They had the earth smell in them, and contributed to give him health and substance. Some of his occupations wrought less desirably upon him. He had a singular propensity, for example, to hang over Maule's well, and look at the constantly shifting phantasmagoria of figures produced by the agitation of the water over the mosaic work of colored pebbles at the bottom. He said that faces looked upward to him there, beautiful faces, arrayed in bewitching smiles, each momentary face so fair and rosy, and every smile so sunny, that he felt wronged at its departure, until the same flitting witchcraft made a new one. But sometimes he would suddenly cry out, "The dark face gazes at me," and be miserable the whole day afterwards. Phoebe, when she hung over the fountain by Clifford's side, could see nothing of all this, neither the beauty nor the ugliness, but only the colored pebbles, looking as if the gush of the waters shook and disarranged them. And the dark face that so troubled Clifford was no more than the shadow thrown from a branch of one of the damson trees, and breaking the inner light of Maule's well. The truth was, however, that his fancy, reviving faster than his will and judgment, and always stronger than they, created shapes of loveliness that were symbolic of his native character, and now and then a stern and dreadful shape that typified his fate. On Sundays, after Phoebe had been at church, for the girl had a church-going conscience, and would hardly have been at ease had she missed either prayer, singing, sermon, or benediction. After church time, therefore, there was ordinarily a sober little festival in the garden. In addition to Clifford, Hepzibah, and Phoebe, 2 guests made up the company. One was the artist Holgrave, who, in spite of his consociation with reformers and his other queer and questionable traits, continued to hold an elevated place in Hepzibah's regard. The other, we are almost ashamed to say, was the venerable Uncle Venner, in a clean shirt and a broadcloth coat, more respectable than his ordinary wear, inasmuch as it was neatly patched on each elbow, and might be called an entire garment, except for a slight inequality in the length of its skirts. Clifford, on several occasions, had seemed to enjoy the old man's intercourse, for the sake of his mellow, cheerful vein, which was like the sweet flavor of a frost-bitten apple, such as one picks up under the tree in December. A man at the very lowest point of the social scale was easier and more agreeable for the fallen gentleman to encounter than a person at any of the intermediate degrees, and moreover, as Clifford's young manhood had been lost, he was fond of feeling himself comparatively youthful, now in apposition with the patriarchal age of Uncle Venner. In fact, it was sometimes observable that Clifford half-wilfully hid from himself the consciousness of being stricken in years, and cherished visions of an earthly future still before him. Visions, however, too indistinctly drawn to be followed by disappointment, though doubtless by depression, when any casual incident or recollection made him sensible of the withered leaf. So this oddly composed little social party used to assemble under the ruinous arbor. Hepzibah, stately as ever at heart, and yielding not an inch of her old gentility, but resting upon it so much the more as justifying a princess-like condescension, exhibited a not ungraceful hospitality. She talked kindly to the vagrant artist, and took sage counsel, lady as she was, with the wood-sawyer, the messenger of everybody's petty errands, the patched philosopher. And Uncle Venner, who had studied the world at street corners, and other posts equally well adapted for just observation, was as ready to give out his wisdom as a town pump to give water. "Miss Hepzibah, ma'am," said he once, after they had all been cheerful together, "I really enjoy these quiet little meetings of a Sabbath afternoon. They are very much like what I expect to have after I retire to my farm." "Uncle Venner," observed Clifford in a drowsy, inward tone, "is always talking about his farm. But I have a better scheme for him by and by. We shall see." "Ah, Mr. Clifford Pyncheon," said the man of patches, "you may scheme for me as much as you please, but I'm not going to give up this one scheme of my own, even if I never bring it really to pass. It does seem to me that men make a wonderful mistake in trying to heap up property upon property. If I had done so, I should feel as if Providence was not bound to take care of me, and at all events the city wouldn't be. I'm one of those people who think that infinity is big enough for us all, and eternity long enough." "Why, so they are, Uncle Venner," remarked Phoebe after a pause, for she had been trying to fathom the profundity and appositeness of this concluding apothegm. "But for this short life of ours, one would like a house and a moderate garden spot of one's own." "It appears to me," said the daguerreotypist, smiling, "that Uncle Venner has the principles of Fourier at the bottom of his wisdom, only they have not quite so much distinctness in his mind as in that of the systematizing Frenchman." "Come, Phoebe," said Hepzibah, "it is time to bring the currants." And then, while the yellow richness of the declining sunshine still fell into the open space of the garden, Phoebe brought out a loaf of bread and a china bowl of currants, freshly gathered from the bushes and crushed with sugar. These, with water, but not from the fountain of ill omen close at hand, constituted all the entertainment. Meanwhile, Holgrave took some pains to establish an intercourse with Clifford, actuated, it might seem, entirely by an impulse of kindliness, in order that the present hour might be cheerfuller than most which the poor recluse had spent, or was destined yet to spend. Nevertheless, in the artist's deep, thoughtful, all-observant eyes, there was now and then an expression not sinister, but questionable, as if he had some other interest in the scene than a stranger, a youthful and unconnected adventurer, might be supposed to have. With great mobility of outward mood, however, he applied himself to the task of enlivening the party, and with so much success that even dark-hued Hepzibah threw off one tint of melancholy, and made what shift she could with the remaining portion. Phoebe said to herself, "How pleasant he can be!" As for Uncle Venner, as a mark of friendship and approbation, he readily consented to afford the young man his countenance in the way of his profession, not metaphorically, be it understood, but literally, by allowing a daguerreotype of his face, so familiar to the town, to be exhibited at the entrance of Holgrave's studio. Clifford, as the company partook of their little banquet, grew to be the gayest of them all. Either it was one of those up-quivering flashes of the spirit to which minds in an abnormal state are liable, or else the artist had subtly touched some chord that made musical vibration. Indeed, what with the pleasant summer evening and the sympathy of this little circle of not unkindly souls, it was perhaps natural that a character so susceptible as Clifford's should become animated, and show itself readily responsive to what was said around him. But he gave out his own thoughts, likewise, with an airy and fanciful glow, so that they glistened, as it were, through the arbour, and made their escape among the interstices of the foliage. He had been as cheerful, no doubt, while alone with Phoebe, but never with such tokens of acute, although partial, intelligence. But as the sunlight left the peaks of the Seven Gables, so did the excitement fade out of Clifford's eyes. He gazed vaguely and mournfully about him, as if he missed something precious, and missed it the more drearily for not knowing precisely what it was. "I want my happiness," at last he murmured, hoarsely and indistinctly, hardly shaping out the words. "Many, many years have I waited for it. It is late. It is late. I want my happiness." Alas, poor Clifford, you are old and worn with troubles that ought never to have befallen you. You are partly crazy and partly imbecile, a ruin, a failure, as almost everybody is, though some in less degree or less perceptibly than their fellows. Fate has no happiness in store for you, unless your quiet home in the old family residence, with the faithful Hepzibah, and your long summer afternoons with Phoebe, and these Sabbath festivals with Uncle Venner and the daguerreotypist, deserve to be called happiness. Why not? If not the thing itself, it is marvellously like it, and the more so for that ethereal and intangible quality which causes it all to vanish at too close an introspection. Take it, therefore, while you may. Murmur not, question not, but make the most of it. End of Chapter 10 of The House of the Seven Gables by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Read by Nicodemus. Chapter 11. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 11 of The House of the Seven Gables by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Read by Nicodemus. The Arched Window. From the inertness, or what we may term the vegetative character, of his ordinary mood, Clifford would perhaps have been content to spend one day after another interminably, or at least throughout the summer-time, in just the kind of life described in the preceding pages. Fancying, however, that it might be for his benefit occasionally to diversify the scene, Phoebe sometimes suggested that he should look out upon the life of the street. For this purpose they used to mount the staircase together to the second story of the house, where at the termination of a wide entry there was an arched window of uncommonly large dimensions, shaded by a pair of curtains. It opened above the porch, where there had formerly been a balcony, the balustrade of which had long since gone to decay and been removed. At this arched window, throwing it open, but keeping himself in comparative obscurity by means of the curtain, Clifford had an opportunity of witnessing such a portion of the great world's movement as might be supposed to roll through one of the retired streets of a not very populous city. But he and Phoebe made a sight as well worth seeing as any that the city could exhibit. The pale, grey, childish, aged melancholy, yet often simply cheerful and sometimes delicately intelligent aspect of Clifford, peering from behind the faded crimson of the curtain, watching the monotony of everyday occurrences with a kind of inconsequential interest and earnestness, and at every petty throb of his sensibility turning for sympathy to the eyes of the bright young girl. If once he were fairly seated at the window, even Pyncheon Street would hardly be so dull and lonely but that somewhere or other along its extent Clifford might discover matter to occupy his eye, and titillate, if not engross, his observation. Things familiar to the youngest child that had begun its outlook at existence seemed strange to him. A cab, an omnibus, with its populous interior, dropping here and there a passenger, and picking up another, and thus typifying that vast rolling vehicle, the world, the end of whose journey is everywhere and nowhere. These objects he followed eagerly with his eyes, but forgot them before the dust raised by the horses and wheels had settled along their track. As regarded novelties, among which cabs and omnibuses were to be reckoned, his mind appeared to have lost its proper gripe and retentiveness. Twice or thrice, for example, during the sunny hours of the day, a water-cart went along by the Pyncheon house, leaving a broad wake of moistened earth instead of the white dust that had risen at a lady's slightest footfall. It was like a summer shower which the city authorities had caught and tamed, and compelled it into the commonest routine of their convenience. With the water-cart, Clifford could never grow familiar. It always affected him with just the same surprise as at first. His mind took an apparently sharp impression from it, but lost the recollection of this perambulatory shower before its next reappearance, as completely as did the street itself, along which the heat so quickly strewed white dust again. It was the same with the railroad. Clifford could hear the obstreperous howl of the steam devil, and by leaning a little way from the arched window, could catch a glimpse of the trains of cars, flashing a brief transit across the extremity of the street. The idea of terrible energy thus forced upon him was new at every recurrence, and seemed to affect him as disagreeably and with almost as much surprise the 100th time as the first. Nothing gives a sadder sense of decay than this loss or suspension of the power to deal with unaccustomed things, and to keep up with the swiftness of the passing moment. It can merely be a suspended animation, for were the power actually to perish, there would be little use of immortality. We are less than ghosts for the time being, whenever this calamity befalls us. Clifford was indeed the most inveterate of conservatives. All the antique fashions of the street were dear to him, even such as were characterized by a rudeness that would naturally have annoyed his fastidious senses. He loved the old rumbling and jolting carts, the former track of which he still found in his long-buried remembrance, as the observer of today finds the wheel tracks of ancient vehicles in Herculaneum. The butcher's cart, with its snowy canopy, was an acceptable object. So was the fish cart, heralded by its horn. So likewise was the countryman's cart of vegetables, plodding from door to door, with long pauses of the patient horse, while his owner drove a trade in turnips, carrots, summer squashes, string beans, green peas, and new potatoes, with half the housewives of the neighborhood. The baker's cart, with the harsh music of its bells, had a pleasant effect on Clifford, because as few things else did, it jingled the very dissonance of yore. One afternoon, a scissor grinder chanced to set his wheel a-going under the Pyncheon elm, and just in front of the arched window. Children came running with their mother's scissors, or the carving knife, or the paternal razor, or anything else that lacked an edge, except indeed poor Clifford's wits, that the grinder might apply the article to his magic wheel, and give it back as good as new. Round went the busily revolving machinery, kept in motion by the scissor grinder's foot, and wore away the hard steel against the hard stone, whence issued an intense and spiteful prolongation of a hiss as fierce as those emitted by Satan in his compeers in Pandemonium, though squeezed into smaller compass. It was an ugly, little venomous serpent of a noise, as ever did petty violence to human ears. But Clifford listened with rapturous delight. The sound, however disagreeable, had very brisk life in it, and together with the circle of curious children watching the revolutions of the wheel, appeared to give him a more vivid sense of active, bustling, and sunshiny existence than he had attained in almost any other way. Nevertheless, its charm lay chiefly in the past, for the scissor grinder's wheel had hissed in his childish ears. He sometimes made doleful complaint that there were no stage-coaches nowadays, and he asked in an injured tone what had become of all those old square-top chaises, with wings sticking out on either side, that used to be drawn by a plough-horse, and driven by a farmer's wife and daughter, peddling whortleberries and blackberries about the town. Their disappearance made him doubt, he said, whether the berries had not left off growing in the broad pastures and along the shady country lanes. But anything that appealed to the sense of beauty, in however humble a way, did not require to be recommended by these old associations. This was observable when one of those Italian boys, who are rather a modern feature of our streets, came along with his barrel organ and stopped under the wide and cool shadows of the elm. With his quick professional eye, he took note of the two faces watching him from the arched window, and opening his instrument, began to scatter its melodies abroad. He had a monkey on his shoulder, dressed in a Highland plaid, and to complete the sum of splendid attractions wherewith he presented himself to the public, there was a company of little figures, whose sphere and habitation was in the mahogany case of his organ, and whose principle of life was the music, which the Italian made it his business to grind out. In all their variety of occupation, the cobbler, the blacksmith, the soldier, the lady with her fan, the toper with his bottle, the milkmaid sitting by her cow, this fortunate little society might truly be said to enjoy a harmonious existence, and to make life literally a dance. The Italian turned a crank, and behold, every one of these small individuals started into the most curious vivacity. The cobbler wrought upon a shoe. The blacksmith hammered his iron. The soldier waved his glittering blade. The lady raised a tiny breeze with her fan. The jolly toper swigged lustily at his bottle. A scholar opened his book with eager thirst for knowledge, and turned his head to and fro along the page. The milkmaid energetically drained her cow, and a miser counted gold into his strong-box, all at the same turning of a crank. Yes, and moved by the self-same impulse, a lover saluted his mistress on her lips. Possibly some cynic, at once merry and bitter, had desired to signify in this pantomimic scene that we mortals, whatever our business or amusement, however serious, however trifling, all dance to one identical tune, and in spite of our ridiculous activity, bring nothing finally to pass. For the most remarkable aspect of the affair was, that at the cessation of the music, everybody was petrified at once, from the most extravagant life into a dead torpor. Neither was the cobbler's shoe finished, nor the blacksmith's iron shaped out, nor was there a drop less of brandy in the toper's bottle, nor a drop more of milk in the milkmaid's pail, nor one additional coin in the miser's strong-box, nor was the scholar a page deeper in his book. All were precisely in the same condition as before they made themselves so ridiculous by their haste to toil, to enjoy, to accumulate gold, and to become wise. Saddest of all, moreover, the lover was none the happier for the maiden's granted kiss. But rather than swallow this last too acrid ingredient, we reject the whole moral of the show. The monkey, meanwhile, with a thick tail curling out into preposterous prolixity from beneath his tartans, took his station at the Italian's feet. He turned a wrinkled and abominable little visage to every passer-by, and to the circle of children that soon gathered round, and to Hepzibah's shop door, and upward to the arched window where Phoebe and Clifford were looking down. Every moment, also, he took off his Highland bonnet, and performed a bow and scrape. Sometimes, moreover, he made personal application to individuals, holding out his small black palm, and otherwise plainly signifying his excessive desire for whatever filthy lucre might happen to be in anybody's pocket. The mean and low, yet strangely manlike expression of his wilted countenance, the prying and crafty glance that showed him ready to gripe at every miserable advantage, his enormous tail, too enormous to be decently concealed under his gaberdine, and the deviltry of nature which it betokened. Take this monkey just as he was, in short, and you could desire no better image of the mammon of copper coin, symbolizing the grossest form of the love of money. Neither was there any possibility of satisfying the covetous little devil. Phoebe threw down a whole handful of cents, which he picked up with joyless eagerness, handed them over to the Italian for safe keeping, and immediately recommenced a series of pantomimic petitions for more. Doubtless more than one New Englander, or let him be of what country he might, it is as likely to be the case, passed by and threw a look at the monkey, and went on, without imagining how nearly his own moral condition was here exemplified. Clifford, however, was a being of another order. He had taken childish delight in the music, and smiled too at the figures which it set in motion. But after looking a while at the long-tailed imp, he was so shocked by his horrible ugliness, spiritual as well as physical, that he actually began to shed tears. A weakness which men of merely delicate endowments, and destitute of the fiercer, deeper, and more tragic power of laughter, can hardly avoid, when the worst and meanest aspect of life happens to be presented to them. Pyncheon Street was sometimes enlivened by spectacles of more imposing pretensions than the above, and which brought the multitude along with them. With the shivering repugnance at the idea of personal contact with the world, a powerful impulse still seized on Clifford, whenever the rush and roar of the human tide grew strongly audible to him. This was made evident one day when a political procession, with hundreds of flaunting banners and drums, fifes, clarions, and cymbals, reverberating between the rows of buildings, marched all through town, and trailed its length of trampling footsteps and most infrequent uproar, past the ordinarily quiet house of the Seven Gables. As a mere object of sight, nothing is more deficient in picturesque features than a procession seen in its passage through narrow streets. The spectator feels it to be fool's play when he can distinguish the tedious commonplace of each man's visage, with the perspiration and weary self-importance on it, and the very cut of his pantaloons, and the stiffness or laxity of his shirt-collar, and the dust on the back of his black coat. In order to become majestic, it should be viewed from some vantage point, as it rolls its slow and long array through the center of a wide plain, or the stateliest public square of a city, for then, by its remoteness, it melts all the petty personalities of which it is made up into one broad mass of existence, one great life, one collected body of mankind, with the vast, homogeneous spirit animating it. But on the other hand, if an impressible person, standing alone over the brink of one of these processions, should behold it, not in its atoms, but in its aggregate, as a mighty river of life, massive in its tide and black with mystery, and out of its depths calling to the kindred depth within him, then the contiguity would add to the effect. It might so fascinate him that he would hardly be restrained from plunging into the surging stream of human sympathies. So it proved with Clifford. He shuddered, he grew pale, he threw an appalling look at Hepzibah and Phoebe, who were with him at the window. They comprehended nothing of his emotions, and supposed him merely disturbed by the unaccustomed tumult. At last, with tremulous limbs, he started up, set his foot on the window-sill, and in an instant more would have been in the unguarded balcony. As it was, the whole procession might have seen him, a wild, haggard figure, his grey locks floating in the wind that waved their banners, a lonely being estranged from his race, but now feeling himself man again, by virtue of the irrepressible instinct that possessed him. Had Clifford attained the balcony, he would probably have leaped into the street, but whether impelled by the species of terror that sometimes urges its victims over the very precipice which he shrinks from, or by a natural magnetism tending towards the great centre of humanity, it were not easy to decide. Both impulses might have wrought on him at once. But his companions, affrighted by his gesture, which was that of a man hurried away in spite of himself, seized Clifford's garment and held him back. Hepzibah shrieked. Phoebe, to whom all extravagance was a horror, burst into sobs and tears. "Clifford, Clifford, are you crazy?" cried his sister. "I hardly know, Hepzibah," said Clifford, drawing a long breath. "Fear nothing, it is over now. But had I taken that plunge and survived it, methinks it would have made me another man." Possibly in some sense Clifford may have been right. He needed a shock, or perhaps he required to take a deep plunge into the ocean of human life, and to sink down and be covered by its profoundness, and then to emerge sobered, invigorated, restored to the world and to himself. Perhaps again he required nothing less than the great final remedy, death. A similar yearning to renew the broken links of brotherhood with his kind sometimes showed itself in a milder form, and once it was made beautiful by the religion that lay even deeper than itself. In the incident now to be sketched, there was a touching recognition, on Clifford's part, of God's care and love towards him, towards this poor, forsaken man, who, if any mortal could, might have been pardoned for regarding himself as thrown aside, forgotten, and left to be the sport of some fiend, whose playfulness was an ecstasy of mischief. It was the Sabbath morning, one of those bright, calm Sabbaths, with its own hallowed atmosphere, when heaven seems to diffuse itself over the earth's face in a solemn smile, no less sweet than solemn. On such a Sabbath morn, were we pure enough to be its medium, we should be conscious of the earth's natural worship ascending through our frames on whatever spot of ground we stood. The church bells, with various tones, but all in harmony, were calling out and responding to one another. It is the Sabbath, yea, the Sabbath. And over the whole city the bells scattered the blessed sounds, now slowly, now with livelier joy, now one bell alone, now all the bells together, crying earnestly, "It is the Sabbath!" and flinging their accents far off, to melt into the air and pervade it with the holy word. The air, with God's sweetest and tenderest sunshine in it, was meet for mankind to breathe into their hearts, and send it forth again as the utterance of prayer. Clifford sat at the window with Hepzibah, watching the neighbors as they stepped into the street. All of them, however unspiritual on other days, were transfigured by the Sabbath influence, so that their very garments, whether it were an old man's decent coat, well brushed for the 1000th time, or a little boy's first sack and trousers, finished yesterday by his mother's needle, had somewhat of the quality of ascension robes. Forth, likewise, from the portal of the old house stepped Phoebe, putting up her small green sunshade, and throwing upward a glance and smile of parting kindness to the faces at the arched window. In her aspect there was a familiar gladness and a holiness that you could play with, and yet reverence it as much as ever. She was like a prayer, offered up in the homeliest beauty of one's mother tongue. Fresh was Phoebe, moreover, and airy and sweet in her apparel, as if nothing that she wore, neither her gown, nor her small straw bonnet, nor her little kerchief, any more than her snowy stockings, had ever been put on before, or if worn, were all the fresher for it, and with a fragrance as if they had lain among the rosebuds. The girl waved her hand to Hepzibah and Clifford, and went up the street, a religion in herself, warm, simple, true, with a substance that could walk on earth, and a spirit that was capable of heaven. "Hepzibah," asked Clifford, after watching Phoebe to the corner, "do you never go to church?" "No, Clifford," she replied, "not these many, many years." "Were I to be there," he rejoined, "it seems to me that I could pray once more, when so many human souls were praying all around me." She looked into Clifford's face, and beheld there a soft, natural effusion. For his heart gushed out, as it were, and ran over at his eyes, in delightful reverence for God and kindly affection for his human brethren. The emotion communicated itself to Hepzibah. She yearned to take him by the hand, and go and kneel down, they two together, both so long separate from the world, and as she now recognized, scarcely friends with him above, to kneel down among the people and be reconciled to God and man at once. "Dear brother," said she earnestly, "let us go. We belong nowhere. We have not a foot of space in any church to kneel upon, but let us go to some place of worship, even if we stand in the broad aisle. Poor and forsaken as we are, some pew door will be open to us." So Hepzibah and her brother made themselves ready as they could in the best of their old-fashioned garments, which had hung on pegs or been laid away in trunks so long that the dampness and mouldy smell of the past was on them, made themselves ready, in their faded bettermost, to go to church. They descended the staircase together, gaunt, sallow Hepzibah, and pale, emaciated, age-stricken Clifford. They pulled open the front door and stepped across the threshold, and felt both of them as if they were standing in the presence of the whole world, and with mankind's great and terrible eye on them alone. The eye of their father seemed to be withdrawn, and gave them no encouragement. The warm, sunny air on the street made them shiver. Their hearts quaked within them at the idea of taking one step farther. "It cannot be, Hepzibah. It is too late," said Clifford, with deep sadness. "We are ghosts. We have no right among human beings, no right anywhere but in this old house, which has a curse on it, and which therefore we are doomed to haunt. And besides," he continued, with a fastidious sensibility, inalienably characteristic of the man, "it would not be fit or beautiful to go. It is an ugly thought that I should be frightful to my fellow beings, and that children would cling to their mothers' gowns at sight of me." They shrank back into the dusky passageway and closed the door. But going up the staircase again, they found the whole interior of the house tenfold more dismal, and the air closer and heavier, for the glimpse and breath of freedom which they had just snatched. They could not flee. Their jailer had but left the door ajar in mockery, and stood behind it to watch them stealing out. At the threshold they felt his pitiless gripe upon them. For what other dungeon is so dark as one's own heart? What jailer so inexorable as one's self? But it would be no fair picture of Clifford's state of mind were we to represent him as continually or prevailingly wretched. On the contrary, there was no other man in the city, we are bold to affirm, of so much as half his years, who enjoyed so many lightsome and griefless moments as himself. He had no burden of care upon him. There were none of those questions and contingencies, with the future to be settled, which wear away all other lives, and render them not worth having by the very process of providing for their support. In this respect he was a child for the whole term of his existence, be it long or short. Indeed, his life seemed to be standing still at a period little in advance of childhood, and to cluster all his reminiscences about that epoch. Just as, after the torpor of a heavy blow, the sufferer's reviving consciousness goes back to a moment considerably behind the accident that stupefied him. He sometimes told Phoebe and Hepzibah his dreams, in which he invariably played the part of a child, or a very young man. So vivid were they, in his relation of them, that he once held a dispute with his sister as to the particular figure or print of a chintz morning dress which he had seen their mother wear, in the dream of the preceding night. Hepzibah, piquing herself on a woman's accuracy in such matters, held it to be slightly different from what Clifford described, but producing the very gown from an old trunk, it proved to be identical with his remembrance of it. Had Clifford, every time that he emerged out of dreams so lifelike, undergone the torture of transformation from a boy into an old and broken man, the daily recurrence of the shock would have been too much to bear. It would have caused an acute agony to thrill from the morning twilight all the day through until bedtime, and even then would have mingled a dull, inscrutable pain and pallid hue of misfortune with the visionary bloom and adolescence of his slumber. But the nightly moonshine interwove itself with the morning mist, and enveloped him as in a robe, which he hugged about his person, and seldom let realities pierce through. He was not often quite awake, but slept open-eyed, and perhaps fancied himself most dreaming then. Thus, lingering always so near his childhood, he had sympathies with children, and kept his heart the fresher thereby, like a reservoir into which rivulets were pouring not far from the fountain-head. Though prevented by a subtle sense of propriety from desiring to associate with them, he loved few things better than to look out of the arched window and see a little girl driving her hoop along the sidewalk, or schoolboys at a game of ball. Their voices also were very pleasant to him, heard at a distance, all swarming and intermingling together as flies do in a sunny room. Clifford would, doubtless, have been glad to share their sports. One afternoon he was seized with an irresistible desire to blow soap bubbles, an amusement, as Hepzibah told Phoebe apart, that had been a favourite one with her brother when they were both children. Behold him, therefore, at the arched window, with an earthen pipe in his mouth. Behold him with his grey hair and a wan, unreal smile over his countenance, where still hovered a beautiful grace, which his worst enemy must have acknowledged to be spiritual and immortal, since it had survived so long. Behold him, scattering airy spheres abroad from the window into the street. Little impalpable worlds were those soap bubbles, with the big world depicted in hues bright as imagination on the nothing of their surface. It was curious to see how the passers-by regarded these brilliant fantasies as they came floating down, and made the dull atmosphere imaginative about them. Some stopped to gaze, and perhaps carried a pleasant recollection of the bubbles onward as far as the street corner. Some looked angrily upward, as if poor Clifford wronged them by setting an image of beauty afloat so near their dusty pathway. A great many put out their fingers or their walking-sticks to touch withal, and were perversely gratified, no doubt, when the bubble, with all its pictured earth and sky scene, vanished as if it had never been. At length, just as an elderly gentleman of very dignified presence happened to be passing, a large bubble sailed majestically down and burst right against his nose. He looked up, at first with a stern, keen glance, which penetrated at once into the obscurity behind the arched window. Then with a smile which might be conceived as diffusing a dog-day sultriness for the space of several yards about him. "Aha, Cousin Clifford!" cried Judge Pyncheon. "What, still blowing soap bubbles?" The tone seemed as if meant to be kind and soothing, but yet had a bitterness of sarcasm in it. As for Clifford, an absolute palsy of fear came over him. Apart from any definite cause of dread which his past experience might have given him, he felt that native and original horror of the excellent judge which is proper to a weak, delicate, and apprehensive character in the presence of massive strength. Strength is incomprehensible by weakness, and therefore the more terrible. There is no greater bugbear than a strong-willed relative in the circle of his own connections. End of Chapter 11 of The House of the Seven Gables by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Read by Nicodemus. Chapter 12. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 12 of The House of the Seven Gables by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Read by Nicodemus. The Daguerreotypist. It must not be supposed that the life of a personage naturally so active as Phoebe could be wholly confined within the precincts of the old Pyncheon house. Clifford's demands upon her time were usually satisfied, in those long days, considerably earlier than sunset. Quiet as his daily existence seemed, it nevertheless drained all the resources by which he lived. It was not physical exercise that overwearied him, for except that he sometimes wrought a little with the hoe, or paced the garden walk, or in rainy weather traversed a large unoccupied room, it was his tendency to remain only too quiescent, as regarded any toil of the limbs and muscles. But either there was a smouldering fire within him that consumed his vital energy, or the monotony that would have dragged itself with benumbing effect over a mind differently situated was no monotony to Clifford. Possibly he was in a state of second growth and recovery, and was constantly assimilating nutriment for his spirit and intellect from sights, sounds, and events which passed as a perfect void to persons more practised with the world. As all is activity and vicissitude to the new mind of a child, so might it be likewise to a mind that had undergone a kind of new creation after its long suspended life. Be the cause what it might, Clifford commonly retired to rest, thoroughly exhausted, while the sunbeams were still melting through his window curtains, or were thrown with late lustre on the chamber wall. And while he thus slept early, as other children do, and dreamed of childhood, Phoebe was free to follow her own tastes for the remainder of the day and evening. This was a freedom essential to the health even of a character so little susceptible of morbid influences as that of Phoebe. The old house, as we have already said, had both the dry rot and the damp rot in its walls. It was not good to breathe no other atmosphere than that. Hepzibah, though she had her valuable and redeeming traits, had grown to be a kind of lunatic by imprisoning herself so long in one place, with no other company than a single series of ideas and but one affection, and one bitter sense of wrong. Clifford, the reader may perhaps imagine, was too inert to operate morally on his fellow creatures, however intimate and exclusive their relations with him. But the sympathy or magnetism among human beings is more subtle and universal than we think. It exists, indeed, among different classes of organized life, and vibrates from one to another. A flower, for instance, as Phoebe herself observed, always began to droop sooner in Clifford's hand, or Hepzibah's, than in her own, and by the same law, converting her whole daily life into a flower fragrance for these two sickly spirits, the blooming girl must inevitably droop and fade much sooner than if worn on a younger and happier breast. Unless she had now and then indulged her brisk impulses, and breathed rural air in a suburban walk or ocean breezes along the shore, had occasionally obeyed the impulse of nature in New England girls by attending a metaphysical or philosophical lecture, or viewing a 7-mile panorama, or listening to a concert, had gone shopping about the city, ransacking entire depots of splendid merchandise and bringing home a ribbon, had employed likewise a little time to read the Bible in her chamber, and had stolen a little more to think of her mother and her native place, unless for such moral medicines as the above, we should soon have beheld our poor Phoebe grow thin and put on a bleached, unwholesome aspect, and assume strange, shy ways, prophetic of old maidenhood and a cheerless future. Even as it was, a change grew visible, a change partly to be regretted, although whatever charm it infringed upon was repaired by another, perhaps more precious. She was not so constantly gay, but had her moods of thought, which Clifford on the whole liked better than her former phase of unmingled cheerfulness, because now she understood him better and more delicately, and sometimes even interpreted him to himself. Her eyes looked larger and darker and deeper, so deep at some silent moments that they seemed like artesian wells, down, down into the infinite. She was less girlish than when we first beheld her alighting from the omnibus, less girlish but more a woman. The only youthful mind with which Phoebe had an opportunity of frequent intercourse was that of the daguerreotypist. Inevitably, by the pressure of the seclusion about them, they had been brought into habits of some familiarity. Had they met under different circumstances, neither of these young persons would have been likely to bestow much thought upon the other, unless indeed their extreme dissimilarity should have proved a principle of mutual attraction. Both, it is true, were characters proper to New England life, and possessing a common ground, therefore, in their more external developments, but as unlike in their respective interiors as if their native climes had been at world-wide distance. During the early part of their acquaintance, Phoebe had held back rather more than was customary with her frank and simple manners from Holgrave's not very marked advances, nor was she yet satisfied that she knew him well, although they almost daily met and talked together in a kind, friendly, and what seemed to be a familiar way. The artist, in a desultory manner, had imparted to Phoebe something of his history. Young as he was, and had his career terminated at the point already attained, there had been enough of incident to fill, very creditably, an autobiographic volume. A romance on the plan of Gil Blas, adapted to American society and manners, would cease to be a romance. The experience of many individuals among us who think it hardly worth the telling would equal the vicissitudes of the Spaniard's earlier life, while their ultimate success, or the point whither they tend, may be incomparably higher than any that a novelist would imagine for his hero. Holgrave, as he told Phoebe somewhat proudly, could not boast of his origin, unless as being exceedingly humble, nor of his education, except that it had been the scantiest possible, and obtained by a few winter months' attendance at a district school. Left early to his own guidance, he had begun to be self-dependent while yet a boy, and it was a condition aptly suited to his natural force of will. Though now but 20 years old, lacking some months which are years in such a life, he had already been, first a country schoolmaster, next a salesman in a country store, and either at the same time or afterwards the political editor of a country newspaper. He had subsequently travelled New England and the Middle States as a peddler, in the employment of a Connecticut manufactory of cologne water and other essences. In an episodical way he had studied and practiced dentistry, and with very flattering success, especially in many of the factory towns along our inland streams. As a supernumerary official of some kind or other, aboard a packet ship, he had visited Europe, and found means before his return to see Italy and part of France and Germany. At a later period he had spent some months in a community of Fourierists. Still more recently he had been a public lecturer on mesmerism, for which science, as he assured Phoebe, and indeed satisfactorily proved by putting Chanticleer, who happened to be scratching near-by, to sleep, he had very remarkable endowments. His present phase as a daguerreotypist was of no more importance in his own view, nor likely to be more permanent, than any of the preceding ones. It had been taken up with the careless alacrity of an adventurer, who had his bread to earn. It would be thrown aside as carelessly whenever he should choose to earn his bread by some other equally digressive means. But what was more remarkable, and perhaps showed a more than common poise in the young man, was the fact that, amid all these personal vicissitudes, he had never lost his identity. Homeless as he had been, continually changing his whereabout, and therefore responsible neither to public opinion nor to individuals, putting off one exterior and snatching up another, to be soon shifted for a third, he had never violated the innermost man, but had carried his conscience along with him. It was impossible to know Holgrave without recognizing this to be the fact. Hepzibah had seen it. Phoebe soon saw it likewise, and gave him the sort of confidence which such a certainty inspires. She was startled, however, and sometimes repelled, not by any doubt of his integrity to whatever law he acknowledged, but by a sense that his law differed from her own. He made her uneasy, and seemed to unsettle everything around her by his lack of reverence for what was fixed, unless at a moment's warning it could establish its right to hold its ground. Then, moreover, she scarcely thought him affectionate in his nature. He was too calm and cool an observer. Phoebe felt his eye often, his heart seldom or never. He took a certain kind of interest in Hepzibah and her brother, and Phoebe herself. He studied them attentively, and allowed no slightest circumstance of their individualities to escape him. He was ready to do them whatever good he might, but after all he never exactly made common cause with them, nor gave any reliable evidence that he loved them better in proportion as he knew them more. In his relations with them he seemed to be in quest of mental food, not heart sustenance. Phoebe could not conceive what interested him so much in her friends and herself, intellectually, since he cared nothing for them, or comparatively so little as objects of human affection. Always in his interviews with Phoebe, the artist made a special inquiry as to the welfare of Clifford, whom, except at the Sunday festival, he seldom saw. "Does he still seem happy?" he asked one day. "As happy as a child," answered Phoebe, "but, like a child, too, very easily disturbed." "How disturbed?" inquired Holgrave. "By things without, or by thoughts within?" "I cannot see his thoughts. How should I?" replied Phoebe with simple piquancy. "Very often his humour changes without any reason that can be guessed at, just as a cloud comes over the sun. Latterly, since I have begun to know him better, I feel it to be not quite right to look closely into his moods. He has had such a great sorrow that his heart is made all solemn and sacred by it. When he is cheerful, when the sun shines into his mind, then I venture to peep in, just as far as the light reaches, but no further. It is holy ground where the shadow falls." "How prettily you express this sentiment," said the artist. "I can understand the feeling without possessing it. Had I your opportunities, no scruples would prevent me from fathoming Clifford to the full depth of my plummet line." "How strange that you should wish it," remarked Phoebe involuntarily. "What is Cousin Clifford to you?" "Oh, nothing, of course, nothing," answered Holgrave with a smile. "Only this is such an odd and incomprehensible world. The more I look at it, the more it puzzles me, and I begin to suspect that a man's bewilderment is the measure of his wisdom. Men and women, and children too, are such strange creatures, that one never can be certain that he really knows them, nor ever guess what they have been from what he sees them to be now. Judge Pyncheon, Clifford, what a complex riddle, a complexity of complexities do they present. It requires intuitive sympathy, like a young girl's, to solve it. A mere observer like myself, who never had any intuitions, and am at best only subtle and acute, is pretty certain to go astray. The artist now turned the conversation to themes less dark than that which they had touched upon. Phoebe and he were young together, nor had Holgrave, in his premature experience of life, wasted entirely that beautiful spirit of youth, which, gushing forth from one small heart and fancy, may diffuse itself over the universe, making it all as bright as on the first day of creation. Man's own youth is the world's youth, at least he feels as if it were, and imagines that the earth's granite substance is something not yet hardened, and which he can mould into whatever shape he likes. So it was with Holgrave. He could talk sagely about the world's old age, but never actually believed what he said. He was a young man still, and therefore looked upon the world, that grey-bearded and wrinkled profligate, decrepit without being venerable, as a tender stripling, capable of being improved into all that it ought to be, but scarcely yet had shown the remotest promise of becoming. He had that sense or inward prophecy, which a young man had better never have been born than not to have, and a mature man had better die at once than utterly to relinquish, that we are not doomed to creep on forever in the old bad way, but that this very now there are the harbingers abroad of a golden era, to be accomplished in his own lifetime. It seemed to Holgrave, as doubtless it has seemed to the hopeful of every century since the epoch of Adam's grandchildren, that in this age, more than ever before, the moss-grown and rotten past is to be torn down, and lifeless institutions to be thrust out of the way, and their dead corpses buried, and everything to begin anew. As to the main point, may we never live to doubt it, as to the better centuries that are coming, the artist was surely right. His error lay in supposing that this age, more than any past or future one, is destined to see the tattered garments of antiquity exchanged for a new suit, instead of gradually renewing themselves by patchwork, in applying his own little life-span as the measure of an interminable achievement, and more than all, in fancying that it mattered anything to the great end in view, whether he himself should contend for it or against it. Yet it was well for him to think so. This enthusiasm, infusing itself through the calmness of his character, and thus taking an aspect of settled thought and wisdom, would serve to keep his youth pure, and make his aspirations high. And when, with the years settling down more weightily upon him, his early faith should be modified by inevitable experience, it would be with no harsh and sudden revolution of his sentiments. He would still have faith in man's brightening destiny, and perhaps love him all the better, as he should recognize his helplessness in his own behalf. And the haughty faith with which he began life would be well bartered for a far humbler one at its close, in discerning that man's best directed effort accomplishes a kind of dream, while God is the sole worker of realities. Holgrave had read very little, and that little in passing through the thoroughfare of life, where the mystic language of books was necessarily mixed up with the babble of the multitude, so that both one and the other were apt to lose any sense that might have been properly their own. He considered himself a thinker, and was certainly of a thoughtful turn, but with his own path to discover, had perhaps hardly yet reached the point where an educated man begins to think. The true value of his character lay in that deep consciousness of inward strength, which made all his past vicissitudes seem merely like a change of garments, and that enthusiasm, so quiet that he scarcely knew of its existence, but which gave a warmth to everything that he laid his hand on, and that personal ambition, hidden from his own as well as other eyes among his more generous impulses, but in which lurked a certain efficacy that might solidify him from a theorist into the champion of some practical cause. Altogether, in his culture and want of culture, in his crude, wild, and misty philosophy, and the practical experience that counteracted some of his tendencies, in his magnanimous zeal for man's welfare, and his recklessness of whatever the ages had established in man's behalf, in his faith and in his infidelity, in what he had and in what he lacked, the artist might fitly enough stand forth as the representative of many compeers in his native land. His career it would be difficult to prefigure. There appeared to be qualities in Holgrave, such as, in a country where everything is free to hand that can grasp it, could hardly fail to put some of the world's prizes within his reach. But these matters are delightfully uncertain. At almost every step in life, we meet with young men of just about Holgrave's age, for whom we anticipate wonderful things, but of whom, even after much and careful inquiry, we never happen to hear another word. The effervescence of youth and passion, and the fresh gloss of the intellect and imagination, endow them with a false brilliancy, which makes fools of themselves and other people. Like certain chintzes, calicoes, and ginghams, they show finely in their first newness, but cannot stand the sun and rain, and assume a very sober aspect after washing day. But our business is with Holgrave as we find him on this particular afternoon, and in the arbour of the Pyncheon garden. In that point of view, it was a pleasant sight to behold this young man, with so much faith in himself, and so fair an appearance of admirable powers, so little harmed, too, by the many tests that had tried his mettle. It was pleasant to see him in this kindly intercourse with Phoebe. Her thought had scarcely done him justice when it pronounced him cold, or if so, he had grown warmer now. Without such purpose on her part, and unconsciously on his, she made the house of the Seven Gables like a home to him, and the garden a familiar precinct. With the insight on which he prided himself, he fancied that he could look through Phoebe and all around her, and could read her off like a page of a child's story-book. But these transparent natures are often deceptive in their depth. Those pebbles at the bottom of the fountain are farther from us than we think. Thus the artist, whatever he might judge of Phoebe's capacity, was beguiled, by some silent charm of hers, to talk freely of what he dreamed of doing in the world. He poured himself out as to another self. Very possibly he forgot Phoebe while he talked to her, and was moved only by the inevitable tendency of thought, when rendered sympathetic by enthusiasm and emotion, to flow into the first safe reservoir which it finds. But had you peeped at them through the chinks of the garden fence, the young man's earnestness and heightened color might have led you to suppose that he was making love to the young girl. At length something was said by Holgrave that made it apposite for Phoebe to inquire what had first brought him acquainted with her cousin Hepzibah, and why he now chose to lodge in the desolate old Pyncheon house. Without directly answering her, he turned from the future, which had heretofore been the theme of his discourse, and began to speak of the influences of the past. One subject, indeed, is but the reverberation of the other. "Shall we never, never get rid of this past?" cried he, keeping up the earnest tone of his preceding conversation. "It lies upon the present like a giant's dead body. In fact, the case is just as if a young giant were compelled to waste all his strength in carrying about the corpse of the old giant, his grandfather, who died a long while ago, and only needs to be decently buried. Just think a moment, and it will startle you to see what slaves we are to bygone times, to death, if we give the matter the right word." "But I do not see it," observed Phoebe. "For example, then," continued Holgrave, "a dead man, if he happens to have made a will, disposes of wealth no longer his own, or if he die intestate, it is distributed in accordance with the notions of men much longer dead than he. A dead man sits on all our judgment seats, and living judges do but search out and repeat his decisions. We read in dead men's books, we laugh at dead men's jokes, and cry at dead men's pathos. We are sick of dead men's diseases, physical and moral, and die of the same remedies with which dead doctors killed their patients. We worship the living deity according to dead men's forms and creeds. Whatever we seek to do of our own free motion, a dead man's icy hand obstructs us. Turn our eyes to what point we may, a dead man's white, immitigable face encounters them, and freezes our very heart. And we must be dead ourselves before we can begin to have our proper influence on our own world, which will then be no longer our world, but the world of another generation, with which we shall have no shadow of a right to interfere. I ought to have said, too, that we live in dead men's houses, as for instance in this of the Seven Gables." "And why not?" said Phoebe, "so long as we can be comfortable in them." "But we shall live to see the day, I trust," went on the artist, "when no man shall build his house for posterity, Why should he? He might just as reasonably order a durable suit of clothes, leather or gutta percha, or whatever else lasts longest, so that his great-grandchildren should have the benefit of them, and cut precisely the same figure in the world that he himself does. If each generation were allowed and expected to build its own houses, that single change, comparatively unimportant in itself, would imply almost every reform which society is now suffering for. I doubt whether even our public edifices, our capitals, state houses, court houses, city hall, and churches, ought to be built of such permanent materials as stone or brick. It were better that they should crumble to ruin once in 20 years, or thereabouts, as a hint to the people to examine into and reform the institutions which they symbolize. "How you hate everything old," said Phoebe in dismay. "It makes me dizzy to think of such a shifting world." "I certainly love nothing mouldy," answered Holgrave. "Now this old Pyncheon house, is it a wholesome place to live in, with its black shingles and the green moss that shows how damp they are? Its dark, low-studded rooms, its grime and sordidness, which are the crystallization on its walls of the human breath that has been drawn and exhaled here in discontent and anguish? The house ought to be purified with fire, purified till only its ashes remain." "Then why do you live in it?" asked Phoebe, a little piqued. "Oh, I am pursuing my studies here. Not in books, however," replied Holgrave. "The house, in my view, is expressive of that odious and abominable past, with all its bad influences, against which I have just been declaiming. I dwell in it for a while, that I may know the better how to hate it. By the by, did you ever hear the story of Maul, the wizard, and what happened between him and your immeasurably great-grandfather?" "Yes, indeed," said Phoebe. "I heard it long ago from my father, and 2 or 3 times from my cousin Hepzibah in the month that I have been here. She seems to think that all the calamities of the Pyncheons began from that quarrel with the wizard, as you call him. And you, Mr. Holgrave, look as you thought so too. How singular that you should believe what is so very absurd, when you reject many things that are a great deal worthier of credit." "I do believe it," said the artist seriously. "Not as a superstition, however, but as proved by unquestionable facts, and as exemplifying a theory. Now, see under those 7 gables at which we now look up, and which old Colonel Pyncheon meant to be the house of his descendants, in prosperity and happiness, down to an epoch far beyond the present. Under that roof, through a portion of 3 centuries, there has been perpetual remorse of conscience, a constantly defeated hope, strife amongst kindred, various misery, a strange form of death, dark suspicion, unspeakable disgrace. All, or most of which calamity, I have the means of tracing to the old Puritan's inordinate desire to plant and endow a family. To plant a family! This idea is at the bottom of most of the wrong and mischief which men do. The truth is, that once in every half-century, at longest, a family should be merged into the great obscure mass of humanity, and forget all about its ancestors. Human blood, in order to keep its freshness, should run in hidden streams, as the water of an aqueduct is conveyed in subterranean pipes. In the family existence of these Pyncheons, for instance, forgive me, Phoebe, but I cannot think of you as one of them, in their brief New England pedigree, there has been time enough to infect them all with one kind of lunacy or another." "You speak very unceremoniously of my kindred," said Phoebe, debating with herself whether she ought to take offense. "I speak true thoughts to a true mind," answered Holgrave, with a vehemence which Phoebe had not before witnessed in him. "The truth is as I say. Furthermore, the original perpetrator and father of this mischief appears to have perpetuated himself, and still walks the street, at least his very image in mind and body, with the fairest prospect of transmitting to posterity as rich and as wretched an inheritance as he has received." "Do you remember the daguerreotype and its resemblance to the old portrait?" "How strangely in earnest you are!" exclaimed Phoebe, looking at him with surprise and perplexity, half alarmed and partly inclined to laugh. "You talk of the lunacy of the Pyncheons. Is it contagious?" "I understand you," said the artist, coloring and laughing. "I believe I am a little mad. This subject has taken hold of my mind with the strangest tenacity of clutch since I have lodged in yonder gable. As one method of throwing it off, I have put an incident of the Pyncheon family history, with which I happen to be acquainted, into the form of a legend, and mean to publish it in a magazine." "Do you write for the magazines?" inquired Phoebe. "Is it possible you do not know it?" cried Holgrave. "Well, such is literary fame. Yes, Miss Phoebe Pyncheon, among the multitude of my marvelous gifts I have that of writing stories, and my name has figured, I can assure you, on the covers of Graham and Godey, making as respectable an appearance, for aught I could see, as any of the canonized bread roll with which it was associated. In the humorous line, I am thought to have a very pretty way with me, and as for pathos, I am as provocative of tears as an onion. But shall I read you my story?" "Yes, if it is not very long," said Phoebe, and added laughingly, "nor very dull." As this latter point was one which the daguerreotypist could not decide for himself, he forthwith produced his roll of manuscript, and while the late sunbeams gilded the Seven Gables, began to read. End of Chapter 12 of The House of the Seven Gables, by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Read by Nicodemus. Chapter 13. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 13 of The House of the Seven Gables, by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Read by Nicodemus. Alice Pyncheon. There was a message brought one day from the worshipful Gervase Pyncheon to young Matthew Maule the carpenter, desiring his immediate presence at the House of the Seven Gables. "And what does your master want with me?" said the carpenter to Mr. Pyncheon's black servant. "Does the house need any repair?" "Well, it may by this time, and no blame to my father who built it, neither. I was reading the old colonel's tombstone no longer ago than last Sabbath, and reckoning from that date, the house has stood 37 years. No wonder if there should be a job to do on the roof." "Don't know what massa wants," answered Scipio. "The house is a very good house, and old Colonel Pyncheon thinks so too, I reckon, else why the old man haunt it so, and frighten a poor nigger as he does." "Well, well, friend Scipio, let your master know that I'm coming," said the carpenter with a laugh. "For a fair workman-like job he'll find me his man. And so the house is haunted, is it? It will take a tighter workman than I am to keep the spirits out of the Seven Gables. Even if the colonel would be quiet," he added, muttering to himself, "my old grandfather, the wizard, will be pretty sure to stick to the Pyncheons as long as their walls hold together." "What's that you mutter to yourself, Matthew Maule?" asked Scipio. "And what for do you look so black at me?" "No matter, darky," said the carpenter. "Do you think nobody is to look black but yourself? Go tell your master I'm coming, and if you happen to see Mistress Alice, his daughter, give Matthew Maule's humble respects to her. She has brought a fair face from Italy, fair and gentle and proud has that same Alice Pyncheon." "He talk of Mistress Alice," cried Scipio, as he returned from his errand. "The low carpenter man, he no business so much as look at her a great way off." This young Matthew Maule, the carpenter, it must be observed, was a person little understood, and not very generally liked, in the town where he resided. Not that anything could be alleged against his integrity, or his skill and diligence in the handicraft which he exercised. The aversion, as it might justly be called, with which many persons regarded him was partly the result of his own character and deportment, and partly an inheritance. He was the grandson of a former Matthew Maule, one of the early settlers of the town, and who had been a famous and terrible wizard in his day. This old reprobate was one of the sufferers when Cotton Mather and his brother ministers, and the learned judges and other wise men, and Sir William Phipps, the sagacious governor, made such laudable efforts to weaken the great enemy of souls by sending a multitude of his adherents up the rocky pathway of Gallows Hill. Since those days, no doubt, in consequence of an unfortunate overdoing of a work praiseworthy in itself, the proceedings against the witches had proved far less acceptable to the beneficent father than to that very arch enemy whom they were intended to distress and utterly overwhelm. It is not the less certain, however, that awe and terror brooded over the memories of those who died for this horrible crime of witchcraft. Their graves, in the crevices of rocks, were supposed to be incapable of retaining the occupants who had been so hastily thrust into them. Old Matthew Maule, especially, was known to have as little hesitation or difficulty in rising out of his grave as an ordinary man in getting out of bed, and was as often seen at midnight as living people at noonday. This pestilent wizard, in whom his just punishment seemed to have wrought no manner of amendment, had an inveterate habit of haunting a certain mansion, styled the House of the Seven Gables, against the owner of which he pretended to hold an unsettled claim for ground rent. The ghost, it appears, with the pertinacity which was one of his distinguishing characteristics while alive, insisted that he was the rightful proprietor of the site upon which the house stood. His terms were that either the aforesaid ground rent, from the day when the cellar began to be dug, should be paid down, or the mansion itself given up, else he, the ghostly creditor, would have his finger in all the affairs of the pensions, and make everything go wrong with them, though it should be 1,000 years after his death. It was a wild story, perhaps, but seemed not altogether so incredible to those who could remember what an inflexibly obstinate old fellow this wizard Maule had been. Now the wizard's grandson, the young Matthew Maule of our story, was popularly supposed to have inherited some of his ancestors' questionable traits. It is wonderful how many absurdities were promulgated in reference to the young man. He was fabled, for example, to have a strange power of getting into people's dreams, and regulating matters there according to his own fancy, pretty much like the stage manager of a theatre. There was a great deal of talk among the neighbors, particularly the petticoated ones, about what they called the witchcraft of Maule's eye. Some said that he could look into people's minds, others that by the marvelous power of this eye he could draw people into his own mind, or send them, if he pleased, to do errands to his grandfather in the spiritual world. Others, again, that it was what is termed an evil eye, and possessed the valuable faculty of blighting corn, and drying children into mummies with the heartburn. But after all, what worked most to the young carpenter's disadvantage was, first, the reserve and sturdiness of his natural disposition, and next, the fact of his not being a church communicant, and the suspicion of his holding heretical tenets in matters of religion and polity. After receiving Mr. Pyncheon's message, the carpenter merely tarried to finish a small job, which he happened to have in hand, and then took his way towards the House of the Seven Gables. This noted edifice, though its style might be getting a little out of fashion, was still as respectable a family residence as that of any gentleman in town. The present owner, Gervase Pyncheon, was said to have contracted a dislike to the house, in consequence of a shock to his sensibility in early childhood from the sudden death of his grandfather. In the very act of running to climb Colonel Pyncheon's knee, the boy had discovered the old Puritan to be a corpse. On arriving at manhood, Mr. Pyncheon had visited England, where he married a lady of fortune, and had subsequently spent many years, partly in the mother country, and partly in various cities on the continent of Europe. During this period, the family mansion had been consigned to the charge of a kinsman, who was allowed to make it his home for the time being, in consideration of keeping the premises in thorough repair. So faithfully had this contract been fulfilled, that now, as the carpenter approached the house, his practised eye could detect nothing to criticize in its condition. The peaks of the Seven Gables rose up sharply, the shingled roof looked thoroughly watertight, and the glittering plasterwork entirely covered the exterior walls, and sparkled in the October sun, as if it had been new only a week ago. The house had that pleasant aspect of life which is like the cheery expression of comfortable activity in the human countenance. You could see at once that there was the stir of a large family within it. A huge load of oak wood was passing through the gateway, towards the outbuildings in the rear. The fat cook, or probably it might be the housekeeper, stood at the side door bargaining for some turkeys and poultry which a countryman had brought for sale. Now and then a maid-servant, neatly dressed, and now the shining sable face of a slave, might be seen bustling across the windows in the lower part of the house. At an open window of a room in the second story, hanging over some pots of beautiful and delicate flowers, exotics but which had never known a more genial sunshine than that of the New England autumn, was the figure of a young lady, an exotic like the flowers, and beautiful and delicate as they. Her presence imparted an indescribable grace and faint witchery to the whole edifice. In other respects, it was a substantial, jolly-looking mansion, and seemed fit to be the residence of a patriarch, who might establish his own headquarters in the front gable and assign one of the remainder to each of his 6 children, while the great chimney in the center should symbolize the old fellow's hospitable heart, which kept them all warm and made a great hole of the 7 smaller ones. There was a vertical sundial on the front gable, and as the carpenter passed beneath it, he looked up and noted the hour. 3 o'clock, said he to himself. My father told me that dial was put up only an hour before the old colonel's death. How truly it has kept time these 37 years past. The shadow creeps and creeps, and is always looking over the shoulder of the sunshine. It might have befitted a craftsman like Matthew Maule, on being sent for to a gentleman's house, to go to the back door, where servants and workpeople were usually admitted, or at least to the side entrance, where the better class of tradesmen made application. But the carpenter had a great deal of pride and stiffness in his nature, and at this moment, moreover, his heart was bitter with the sense of hereditary wrong, because he considered the great Pyncheon house to be standing on soil which should have been his own. On this very site, beside a spring of delicious water, his grandfather had felled the pine trees and built a cottage, in which children had been born to him, and it was only from a dead man's stiffened fingers that Colonel Pyncheon had wrested away the title deeds. So young Maule went straight to the principal entrance, beneath a portal of carved oak, and gave such a peal of the iron knocker that you would have imagined the stern old wizard himself to be standing at the threshold. Black Scipio answered the summons in a prodigious hurry, but showed the whites of his eyes in amazement on beholding only the carpenter. Lord a mercy, what a great man he be, this carpenter fellow, mumbled Scipio down in his throat. Anybody think he beat on the door with his biggest hammer. Here I am, said Maule sternly. Show me the way to your master's parlour. As he stepped into the house, a note of sweet and melancholy music thrilled and vibrated along the passageway, proceeding from one of the rooms above stairs. It was the harpsichord which Alice Pyncheon had brought with her from beyond the sea. The fair Alice bestowed most of her maiden leisure between flowers and music, although the former were apt to droop, and the melodies were often sad. She was of foreign education, and could not take kindly to the New England modes of life, in which nothing beautiful had ever been developed. As Mr. Pyncheon had been impatiently awaiting Maule's arrival, Black Scipio, of course, lost no time in ushering the carpenter into his master's presence. The room in which this gentleman sat was a parlour of moderate size, looking out upon the garden of the house, and having its windows partly shadowed by the foliage of fruit trees. It was Mr. Pyncheon's peculiar apartment, and was provided with furniture in an elegant and costly style, principally from Paris. The floor, which was unusual at that day, being covered with a carpet, so skilfully and richly wrought that it seemed to glow as with living flowers. In one corner stood a marble woman, to whom her own beauty was the sole and sufficient garment. Some pictures, that looked old, and had a mellow tinge diffused through all their artful splendor, hung on the walls. Near the fireplace was a large and very beautiful cabinet of ebony, inlaid with ivory. A piece of antique furniture which Mr. Pyncheon had bought in Venice, and which he used as the treasure place for medals, ancient coins, and whatever small and valuable curiosities he had picked up on his travels. Through all this variety of decoration, however, the room showed its original characteristics, its low stud, its cross beam, its chimney-piece, with the old-fashioned Dutch tiles, so that it was the emblem of a mind industriously stored with foreign ideas and elaborated into artificial refinement, but neither larger nor in its proper self more elegant than before. There were 2 objects that appeared rather out of place in this very handsomely furnished room. One was a large map or surveyor's plan of a tract of land, which looked as if it had been drawn a good many years ago, and was now dingy with smoke and soiled here and there with the touch of fingers. The other was a portrait of a stern old man, in a Puritan garb, painted roughly, but with a bold effect and a remarkably strong expression of character. At a small table before a fire of English sea coal sat Mr. Pyncheon sipping coffee, which had grown to be a very favourite beverage with him in France. He was a middle-aged and really handsome man, with the wig flowing down upon his shoulders. His coat was of blue velvet, with lace on the borders and at the buttonholes, and the firelight glistened on the spacious breadth of his waistcoat, which was flowered all over with gold. On the entrance of Scipio, ushering in the carpenter, Mr. Pyncheon turned partly round, but resumed his former position, and proceeded deliberately to finish his cup of coffee, without immediate notice of the guest whom he had summoned to his presence. It was not that he intended any rudeness or improper neglect, which indeed he would have blushed to be guilty of, but it never occurred to him that a person in Maule's station had a claim on his courtesy, or would trouble himself about it one way or the other. The carpenter, however, stepped at once to the hearth, and turned himself about so as to look Mr. Pyncheon in the face. "You sent for me," said he. "Be pleased to explain your business, that I may go back to my own affairs." "Ah, excuse me," said Mr. Pyncheon quietly. "I did not mean to tax your time without a recompense. Your name, I think, is Maule, Thomas or Matthew Maule, a son or grandson of the builder of this house." "Matthew Maule," replied the carpenter, "son of him who built the house, grandson of the rightful proprietor of the soil." "I know the dispute to which you allude," observed Mr. Pyncheon, with undisturbed equanimity. "I am well aware that my grandfather was compelled to resort to a suit at law in order to establish his claim to the foundation site of this edifice. We will not, if you please, renew the discussion. The matter was settled at the time, and by the competent authorities, equitably it is to be presumed, and at all events irrevocably. Yet singularly enough, there is an incidental reference to this very subject in what I am now about to say to you. And this same inveterate grudge, excuse me, I mean no offence, this irritability, which you have just shown, is not entirely aside from the matter." "If you can find anything for your purpose, Mr. Pyncheon," said the carpenter, "in a man's natural resentment for the wrongs done to his blood, you are welcome to it." "I take you at your word, Goodman Maule," said the owner of the Seven Gables with a smile, "and will proceed to suggest a mode in which your hereditary resentments, justifiable or otherwise, may have had a bearing on my affairs. You have heard, I suppose, that the Pyncheon family, ever since my grandfather's days, have been prosecuting a still unsettled claim to a very large extent of territory at the eastward." "Often," replied Maule, and it is said that a smile came over his face. "Very often from my father." "This claim," continued Mr. Pyncheon, after pausing a moment, as if to consider what the carpenter's smile might mean, "appeared to be on the very verge of a settlement and full allowance at the period of my grandfather's decease. It was well known, to those in his confidence, that he anticipated neither difficulty nor delay. Now Colonel Pyncheon, I need hardly say, was a practical man, well acquainted with public and private business, and not at all the person to cherish ill-founded hopes, or to attempt the following out of an impracticable scheme. It is obvious to conclude, therefore, that he had grounds, not apparent to his heirs, for his confident anticipation of success in the matter of this eastern claim. In a word, I believe, and my legal advisers coincide in the belief, which moreover is authorized, to a certain extent, by the family traditions, that my grandfather was in possession of some deed or other document essential to this claim, but which has since disappeared." "Very likely," said Matthew Maule, and again it is said there was a dark smile on his face. "But what can a poor carpenter have to do with the grand affairs of the Pyncheon family?" "Perhaps nothing," returned Mr. Pyncheon. "Possibly much." Here ensued a great many words between Matthew Maule and the proprietor of the Seven Gables, on the subject which the latter had thus broached. It seems, although Mr. Pyncheon had some hesitation in referring to stories so exceedingly absurd in their subject, that the popular belief pointed to some mysterious connection and dependence existing between the family of the Maules and these vast unrealized possessions of the Pyncheons. It was an ordinary saying that the old wizard, hanged though he was, had obtained the best end of the bargain in this contest with Colonel Pyncheon, inasmuch as he had got possession of the great eastern claim, in exchange for an acre or two of garden ground. A very aged woman, recently dead, had often used the metaphorical expression, in her fireside talk, that miles and miles of the Pyncheon lands had been shovelled into Maule's grave. which, by the by, was but a very shallow nook between two rocks near the summit of Gallows Hill. Again, when the lawyers were making inquiry for the missing document, it was a byword that it would never be found unless in the wizard's skeleton hand. So much weight had the shrewd lawyers assigned to these fables that, but Mr. Pyncheon did not see fit to inform the carpenter of the fact, they had secretly caused the wizard's grave to be searched. Nothing was discovered, however, except that unaccountably the right hand of the skeleton was gone. Now, what was unquestionably important, a portion of these popular rumors could be traced, though rather doubtfully and indistinctly, to chance words and obscure hints of the executed wizard's son, and the father of this present Matthew Maule. And here Mr. Pyncheon could bring an item of his own personal evidence into play. Though but a child at the time, he either remembered or fancied that Matthew's father had had some job to perform on the day before, or possibly the very morning of the colonel's decease, in the private room where he and the carpenter were at this moment talking. Certain papers belonging to Colonel Pyncheon, as his grandson distinctly recollected, had been spread out on the table. Matthew Maule understood the insinuated suspicion. "My father," he said, but still there was that dark smile making a riddle of his countenance. "My father was an honester man than the bloody old colonel. Not to get his rights back again would he have carried off one of those papers." "I shall not bandy words with you," observed the foreign-bred Mr. Pyncheon, with haughty composure, "nor will it become me to resent any rudeness towards either my grandfather or myself. A gentleman, before seeking intercourse with the person of your station and habits, will first consider whether the urgency of the end may compensate for the disagreeableness of the means. It does so in the present instance." He then renewed the conversation, and made great pecuniary offers to the carpenter, in case the latter should give information leading to the discovery of the lost document, and the consequent success of the Eastern claim. For a long time Matthew Maule is said to have turned a cold ear to these propositions. At last, however, with a strange kind of laugh, he inquired whether Mr. Pyncheon would make over to him the old wizard's homestead ground, together with the house of the Seven Gables, now standing on it, in requital of the documentary evidence so urgently required. The wild, chimney-corner legend, which, without copying all its extravagances, my narrative essentially follows, here gives an account of some very strange behaviour on the part of Colonel Pyncheon's portrait. This picture, it must be understood, was supposed to be so intimately connected with the fate of the house, and so magically built into its walls, that if once it should be removed, that very instant the whole edifice would come thundering down in a heap of dusty ruin. All through the foregoing conversation between Mr. Pyncheon and the carpenter, the portrait had been frowning, clenching its fist, and giving many such proofs of excessive discomposure, but without attracting the notice of either of the two colloquists. And finally, at Matthew Maule's audacious suggestion of a transfer of the Seven Gables structure, the ghostly portrait is averred to have lost all patience, and to have shown itself on the point of descending bodily from its frame. But such incredible incidents are merely to be mentioned aside. "Give up this house!" exclaimed Mr. Pyncheon, in amazement at the proposal. "Were I to do so, my grandfather would not rest quiet in his grave." "He never has, if all stories are true," remarked the carpenter composedly. "But that matter concerns his grandson more than it does Matthew Maule. I have no other terms to propose." Impossible as he first thought it, to comply with Maule's conditions, still, on a second glance, Mr. Pyncheon was of opinion that they might at least be made matter of discussion. He himself had no personal attachment for the house, nor any pleasant associations connected with his childish residence in it. On the contrary, after 37 years, the presence of his dead grandfather seemed still to pervade it, as on that morning when the affrighted boy had beheld him, with so ghastly an aspect, stiffening in his chair. His long abode in foreign parts, moreover, and familiarity with many of the castles and ancestral halls of England, and the marble palaces of Italy, had caused him to look contemptuously at the house of the Seven Gables, whether in point of splendour or convenience. It was a mansion exceedingly inadequate to the style of living which it would be incumbent on Mr. Pyncheon to support, after realizing his territorial rights. His steward might deign to occupy it, but never certainly the great landed proprietor himself. In the event of success, indeed, it was his purpose to return to England, nor, to say the truth, would he recently have quitted that more congenial home had not his own future, as well as his deceased wife's, begun to give symptoms of exhaustion. The Eastern claim once fairly settled, and put upon the firm basis of actual possession, Mr. Pyncheon's property, to be measured by miles, not acres, would be worth an earldom, and would reasonably entitle him to solicit, or enable him to purchase, that elevated dignity from the British monarch. Lord Pyncheon, or the Earl of Waldo, how could such a magnate be expected to contract his grandeur within the pitiful compass of 7 shingled gables? In short, on an enlarged view of the business, the carpenter's terms appeared so ridiculously easy that Mr. Pyncheon could scarcely forbear laughing in his face. He was quite ashamed, after the foregoing reflections, to propose any diminution of so moderate a recompense for the immense service to be rendered. "I consent to your proposition, Moll," cried he. "Put me in possession of the document essential to establish my rights, and the house of the 7 Gables is your own." According to some versions of the story, a regular contract to the above effect was drawn up by a lawyer, and signed and sealed in the presence of witnesses. Others say that Matthew Moll was contented with a private written agreement, in which Mr. Pyncheon pledged his honour and integrity to the fulfilment of the terms concluded upon. The gentleman then ordered wine, which he and the carpenter drank together, in confirmation of their bargain. During the whole preceding discussion and subsequent formalities, the old Puritan's portrait seemed to have persisted in its shadowy gestures of disapproval, but without effect, except that as Mr. Pyncheon set down the emptied glass, he thought he beheld his grandfather frown. "This sherry is too potent a wine for me. It has affected my brain already," he observed, after a somewhat startled look at the picture. "On returning to Europe, I shall confine myself to the more delicate vintages of Italy and France, the best of which will not bear transportation." "My Lord Pyncheon may drink what wine he will, and wherever he pleases," replied the carpenter, as if he had been privy to Mr. Pyncheon's ambitious projects. "But first, sir, if you desire tidings of this lost document, I must crave the favour of a little talk with your fair daughter Alice." "You are mad, Moll!" exclaimed Mr. Pyncheon haughtily, and now at last there was anger mixed up with his pride. "What can my daughter have to do with a business like this?" Indeed, at this new demand on the carpenter's part, the proprietor of the 7 Gables was even more thunderstruck than at the cool proposition to surrender his house. There was at least an assignable motive for the first stipulation. There appeared to be none whatever for the last. Nevertheless, Matthew Moll sturdily insisted on the young lady being summoned, and even gave her father to understand, in a mysterious kind of explanation, which made the matter considerably darker than it looked before, that the only chance of acquiring the requisite knowledge was through the clear, crystal medium of a pure and virgin intelligence, like that of the fair Alice. Not to encumber our story with Mr. Pyncheon's scruples, whether of conscience, pride, or fatherly affection, he at length ordered his daughter to be called. He well knew that she was in her chamber, and engaged in no occupation that could not readily be laid aside, for as it happened, ever since Alice's name had been spoken, both her father and the carpenter had heard the sad and sweet music of her harpsichord, and the airier melancholy of her accompanying voice. So Alice Pyncheon was summoned and appeared. A portrait of this young lady, painted by a Venetian artist and left by her father in England, is said to have fallen into the hands of the present Duke of Devonshire, and to be now preserved at Chatsworth, not on account of any associations with the original, but for its value as a picture, and the high character of beauty in the countenance. If ever there was a lady born and set apart from the world's vulgar mass by a certain gentle and cold stateliness, it was this very Alice Pyncheon. Yet there was the womanly mixture in her, the tenderness, or at least the tender capabilities. For the sake of that redeeming quality, a man of generous nature would have forgiven her all pride, and have been content almost to lie down in her path and let Alice set her slender foot upon his heart. All that he would have required was simply the acknowledgment that he was indeed a man, and a fellow being, moulded of the same elements as she. As Alice came into the room, her eyes fell upon the carpenter, who was standing near its centre, clad in green woolen jacket, a pair of loose breeches, open at the knees, and with a long pocket for his rule, the end of which protruded. It was as proper a mark of the artisan's calling as Mr. Pyncheon's full-dress sword of that gentleman's aristocratic pretensions. A glow of artistic approval brightened over Alice Pyncheon's face. She was struck with admiration, which she made no attempt to conceal, of the remarkable comeliness, strength, and energy of Maule's figure. But that admiring glance, which most other men, perhaps, would have cherished as a sweet recollection all through life, the carpenter never forgave. It must have been the devil himself that made Maule so subtle in his perception. "Does the girl look at me as if I were a brute beast?" thought he, setting his teeth. "She shall know whether I have a human spirit, and the worse for her if it proves stronger than her own." "My father, you sent for me," said Alice in her sweet and harp-like voice. "But if you have business with this young man, pray let me go again. You know I do not love this room, in spite of that Claude, with which you try to bring back sunny recollections." "Stay a moment, young lady, if you please," said Matthew Maule. "My business with your father is over. With yourself it is now to begin." Alice looked towards her father in surprise and inquiry. "Yes, Alice," said Mr. Pyncheon, with some disturbance and confusion. "This young man, his name is Matthew Maule, professes, so far as I can understand him, to be able to discover, through your means, a certain paper or parchment, which was missing long before your birth. The importance of the document in question renders it advisable to neglect no possible, even if improbable, method of regaining it. You will therefore oblige me, my dear Alice, by answering this person's inquiries, and complying with his lawful and reasonable requests, so far as they may appear to have the aforesaid object in view. As I shall remain in the room, you need apprehend no rude nor unbecoming deportment on the young man's part, and, at your slightest wish, of course, the investigation, or whatever we may call it, shall immediately be broken off." "Mistress Alice Pyncheon," remarked Matthew Maule, with the utmost deference, but yet a half-hidden sarcasm in his look and tone, "will no doubt feel herself quite safe in her father's presence, and under his all-sufficient protection." "I certainly shall entertain no manner of apprehension, with my father at hand," said Alice with maidenly dignity. "Neither do I conceive that a lady, while true to herself, can have aught to fear from whomsoever, or in any circumstance." Poor Alice! By what unhappy impulse did she thus put herself at once on terms of defiance against a strength which she could not estimate? "Then, Mistress Alice," said Matthew Maule, handing a chair, gracefully enough for a craftsman, "will it please you only to sit down, and do me the favour, though altogether beyond a poor carpenter's deserts, to fix your eyes on mine?" Alice complied. She was very proud. Setting aside all advantages of rank, this fair girl deemed herself conscious of a power, combined of beauty, high unsullied purity, and the preservative force of womanhood, that could make her sphere impenetrable unless betrayed by treachery within. She instinctively knew, it may be, that some sinister or evil potency was now striving to pass her barriers, nor would she decline the contest. So Alice put woman's might against man's might, a match not often equal on the part of woman. Her father, meanwhile, had turned away, and seemed absorbed in the contemplation of a landscape by Claude, where a shadowy and sun-streaked vista penetrated so remotely into an ancient wood that it would have been no wonder if his fancy had lost itself in the picture's bewildering depths. But, in truth, the picture was no more to him at that moment than the blank wall against which it hung. His mind was haunted with the many and strange tales which he had heard, attributing mysterious if not supernatural endowments to these Maules, as well the grandson here present as his two immediate ancestors. Mr. Pyncheon's long residence abroad and intercourse with men of wit and fashion, courtiers, worldlings, and free thinkers, had done much towards obliterating the grim Puritan superstitions, which no man of New England birth at that early period could entirely escape. But on the other hand, Had not a whole community believed Maule's grandfather to be a wizard? Had not the crime been proved? Had not the wizard died for it? Had he not bequeathed a legacy of hatred against the Pyncheons to this only grandson, who, as it appeared, was now about to exercise a subtle influence over the daughter of his enemy's house? Might not this influence be the same that was called witchcraft? Turning half around, he caught a glimpse of Maule's figure in the looking-glass. At some paces from Alice, with his arms uplifted in the air, the carpenter made a gesture as if directing downward a slow, ponderous, and invisible weight upon the maiden. "Stay, Maule," exclaimed Mr. Pyncheon, stepping forward. "I forbid your proceeding further." "Pray, my dear father, do not interrupt the young man," said Alice, without changing her position. "His efforts, I assure you, will prove very harmless." Again Mr. Pyncheon turned his eyes towards the clod. It was then his daughter's will, in opposition to his own, that the experiment should be fully tried. Henceforth, therefore, he did but consent, not urge it. And was it not for her sake, far more than for his own, that he desired its success? That lost parchment once restored, the beautiful Alice Pyncheon, with the rich dowry which he could then bestow, might wed an English duke or a German reigning prince, instead of some New England clergyman or lawyer. At the thought, the ambitious father almost consented in his heart that if the devil's power were needed to the accomplishment of this great object, Maule might invoke him. Alice's own purity would be her safeguard. With his mind full of imaginary magnificence, Mr. Pyncheon heard a half-uttered exclamation from his daughter. It was very faint and low, so indistinct that there seemed but half a will to shape out the words, and too undefined a purport to be intelligible. Yet it was a call for help. His conscience never doubted it, and little more than a whisper to his ear, it was a dismal shriek, and long re-echoed so in the region round his heart. But this time the father did not turn. After a further interval, Maule spoke. "Behold your daughter," said he. Mr. Pyncheon came hastily forward. The carpenter was standing erect in front of Alice's chair, and pointing his finger towards the maiden with an expression of triumphant power, the limits of which could not be defined, as indeed its scope stretched vaguely towards the unseen and the infinite. Alice sat in an attitude of profound repose, with the long brown lashes drooping over her eyes. "There she is," said the carpenter. "Speak to her." "Alice, my daughter!" exclaimed Mr. Pyncheon. "My own Alice!" She did not stir. "Louder," said Maule, smiling. "Alice, awake!" cried her father. "It troubles me to see you thus. Awake!" He spoke loudly, with terror in his voice, and close to that delicate ear which had always been so sensitive to every discord. But the sound evidently reached her not. It is indescribable what a sense of remote, dim, unattainable distance betwixt himself and Alice was impressed on the father by this impossibility of reaching her with his voice. "Best touch her," said Matthew Maule. "Shake the girl, and roughly too. My hands are hardened with too much use of axe, saw, and plane, else I might help you." Mr. Pyncheon took her hand, and pressed it with the earnestness of startled emotion. He kissed her with so great a heart-throb in the kiss that he thought she must needs feel it. Then, in a gust of anger at her insensibility, he shook her maiden form with a violence which the next moment it affrighted him to remember. He withdrew his encircling arms, and Alice, whose figure, though flexible, had been wholly impassive, relapsed into the same attitude as before these attempts to arouse her. Maule, having shifted his position, her face was turned towards him slightly, but with what seemed to be a reference of her very slumber to his guidance. Then it was a strange sight to behold how the man of conventionalities shook the powder out of his periwig, how the reserved and stately gentleman forgot his dignity, how the gold-embroidered waistcoat flickered and glistened in the firelight with the convulsion of rage, terror, and sorrow in the human heart that was beating under it. "Villain!" cried Mr. Pyncheon, shaking his clenched fist at Maule. "You and the fiend together have robbed me of my daughter. Give her back, spawn of the old wizard, or you shall climb Gallows Hill in your grandfather's footsteps." "Softly, Mr. Pyncheon. said the carpenter, with scornful composure. "Softly, and it please your worship, else you will spoil those rich lace ruffles at your wrists. Is it my crime if you have sold your daughter for the mere hope of getting a sheet of yellow parchment into your clutch? There sits Mistress Alice quietly asleep. Now let Matthew Mall try whether she be as proud as the carpenter found her a while since." He spoke, and Alice responded, with a soft, subdued inward acquiescence, and a bending of her form towards him, like the flame of a torch when it indicates a gentle draught of air. He beckoned with his hand, and rising from her chair, blindly but undoubtingly, as tending to her sure and inevitable centre, the proud Alice approached him. He waved her back, and retreating, Alice sank again into her seat. "She is mine," said Matthew Mall, "mine by the right of the strongest spirit." In the further progress of the legend, there is a long, grotesque, and occasionally awe-striking account of the carpenter's incantations, if so they are to be called, with the view of discovering the lost document. It appears to have been his object to convert the mind of Alice into a kind of telescopic medium, through which Mr. Pyncheon and himself might obtain a glimpse into the spiritual world. He succeeded, accordingly, in holding an imperfect sort of intercourse, at one remove, with the departed personages in whose custody the so much valued secret had been carried beyond the precincts of earth. During her trance, Alice described 3 figures as being present to her spiritualized perception. One was an aged, dignified, stern-looking gentleman, clad as for a solemn festival in grave and costly attire, but with a great blood-stain on his richly wrought band. The second, an aged man, meanly dressed, with a dark and malign countenance, and a broken halter about his neck. The third, a person not so advanced in life as the former 2, but beyond the middle age, wearing a coarse woolen tunic and leather breeches, and with a carpenter's rule sticking out of his side pocket. These 3 visionary characters possessed a mutual knowledge of the missing document. One of them, in truth, it was he with the blood-stain on his band, seemed, unless his gestures were misunderstood, to hold the parchment in his immediate keeping, but was prevented by his 2 partners in the mystery from disburdening himself of the trust. Finally, when he showed a purpose of shouting forth the secret loudly enough to be heard from his own sphere into that of mortals, his companions struggled with him, and pressed their hands over his mouth, and forthwith, whether that he were choked by it, or that the secret itself was of a crimson hue, there was a fresh flow of blood upon his band. Upon this, the 2 meanly dressed figures mocked and jeered at the much abashed old dignitary, and pointed their fingers at the stain. At this juncture, Mall turned to Mr. Pyncheon. "It will never be allowed," said he. "The custody of this secret, that would so enrich his heirs, makes part of your grandfather's retribution. He must choke with it until it is no longer of any value. And keep you the house of the 7 Gables. It is too dear bought an inheritance, and too heavy with the curse upon it, to be shifted yet a while from the colonel's posterity." Mr. Pyncheon tried to speak, but, what with fear and passion, could make only a gurgling murmur in his throat. The carpenter smiled. "Aha, worshipful sir, so you have old Mall's blood to drink," said he jeeringly. "Fiend in man's shape, why dost thou keep dominion over my child?" cried Mr. Pyncheon, when his choked utterance could make way. "Give me back my daughter, then go thy ways, and may we never meet again." "Your daughter," said Matthew Mall, "why, she is fairly mine. Nevertheless, not to be too hard with fair Mistress Alice, I will leave her in your keeping. But I do not warrant you that she shall never have occasion to remember Mall the carpenter." He waved his hands with an upward motion, and after a few repetitions of similar gestures, the beautiful Alice Pyncheon awoke from her strange trance. She awoke without the slightest recollection of her visionary experience, but as one losing herself in a momentary reverie, and returning to the consciousness of actual life, in almost as brief an interval as the down-sinking flame of the hearth should quiver again up the chimney. On recognizing Matthew Mall, she assumed an air of somewhat cold but gentle dignity, the rather as there was a certain peculiar smile on the carpenter's visage that stirred the native pride of the fair Alice. So ended for that time the quest for the lost title deed of the Pyncheon territory at the eastward, nor, though often subsequently renewed, has it ever yet befallen a Pyncheon to set his eye upon that parchment. But alas for the beautiful and gentle, yet too haughty Alice! A power that she little dreamed of had laid its grasp upon her maiden soul. A will almost unlike her own constrained her to do its grotesque and fantastic bidding. Her father, as it proved, had martyred his poor child to an inordinate desire for measuring his land by miles instead of acres. And therefore, while Alice Pyncheon lived, she was Moll's slave, in a bondage more humiliating 1,000-fold than that which binds its chain around the body. Seated by his humble fireside, Moll had but to wave his hand, and wherever the proud lady chanced to be, whether in her chamber or entertaining her father's stately guests, or worshipping at church, whatever her place or occupation, her spirit passed from beneath her own control, and bowed itself to Moll. "Alice, laugh," the carpenter beside his hearth would say, or perhaps intensely will it without a spoken word. And even were it prayer time, or at a funeral, Alice must break into wild laughter. "Alice, be sad," and at the instant down would come her tears, quenching all the mirth of those around her, like sudden rain upon a bonfire. "Alice, dance," and dance she would, not in such court-like measures as she had learned abroad, but some high-paced jig or hop-skip-rigadoon, befitting the brisk lasses at a rustic merrymaking. It seemed to be Moll's impulse, not to ruin Alice, nor to visit her with any black or gigantic mischief, which would have crowned her sorrows with the grace of tragedy, but to wreak a low, ungenerous scorn upon her. Thus all the dignity of life was lost. She felt herself too much abased, and longed to change natures with some worm. One evening, at a bridal party, but not her own, for so lost from self-control she would have deemed it sin to marry, poor Alice was beckoned forth by her unseen despot, and constrained, in her gossamer white dress and satin slippers, to hasten along the street to the mean dwelling of a labouring man. There was laughter and good cheer within, for Matthew Moll that night was to wed the labourer's daughter, and had summoned proud Alice Pyncheon to wait upon his bride. And so she did, and when the twain were one, Alice awoke out of her enchanted sleep, yet no longer proud. Humbly, and with a smile all steeped in sadness, she kissed Moll's wife, and went her way. It was an inclement night. The southeast wind drove the mingled snow and rain into her thinly sheltered bosom. Her satin slippers were wet through and through, as she trod the muddy sidewalks. The next day a cold, soon a settled cough, anon a hectic cheek, a wasted form that sat beside the harpsichord, and filled the house with music. Music in which a strain of the heavenly choristers was echoed. O joy, for Alice had borne her last humiliation. O greater joy, for Alice was penitent of her one earthly sin, and proud no more. The Pyncheons made a great funeral for Alice. The kith and kin were there, and the whole respectability of the town besides. But last in the procession came Matthew Moll, gnashing his teeth, as if he would have bitten his own heart in twain, the darkest and woefulest man that ever walked behind a corpse. He meant to humble Alice, not to kill her. But he had taken a woman's delicate soul into his rude gripe, to play with, and she was dead. End of Chapter 13 of The House of the Seven Gables by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Read by Nicodemus. Chapter 14. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 14 of The House of the Seven Gables by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Read by Nicodemus. Phoebe's Goodbye. Holgrave, plunging into his tale with the energy and absorption natural to a young author, had given a good deal of action to the parts capable of being developed and exemplified in that manner. He now observed that a certain remarkable drowsiness, wholly unlike that with which the reader possibly feels himself affected, had been flung over the senses of his auditress. It was the effect, unquestionably, of the mystic gesticulations by which he had sought to bring bodily before Phoebe's perception the figure of the mesmerizing carpenter. With the lids drooping over her eyes, now lifted for an instant and drawn down again as with leaden weights, she leaned slightly towards him, and seemed almost to regulate her breath by his. Holgrave gazed at her as he rolled up his manuscript, and recognized an incipient stage of that curious psychological condition which, as he had himself told Phoebe, he possessed more than an ordinary faculty of producing. A veil was beginning to be muffled about her, in which she could behold only him, and live only in his thoughts and emotions. His glance, as he fastened it on the young girl, grew involuntarily more concentrated. In his attitude there was the consciousness of power, investing his hardly mature figure with a dignity that did not belong to its physical manifestation. It was evident that with but one wave of his hand and a corresponding effort of his will, he could complete his mastery over Phoebe's yet free and virgin spirit. He could establish an influence over this good, pure, and simple child, as dangerous and perhaps as disastrous as that which the carpenter of his legend had acquired and exercised over the ill-fated Alice. To a disposition like Holgrave's, at once speculative and active, there is no temptation so great as the opportunity of acquiring empire over the human spirit, nor any idea more seductive to a young man than to become the arbiter of a young girl's destiny. Let us, therefore, whatever his defects of nature and education, and in spite of his scorn for creeds and institutions, concede to the daguerreotypist the rare and high quality of reverence for another's individuality. Let us allow him integrity also, for ever after to be confided in, since he forbade himself to twine that one link more which might have rendered his spell over Phoebe indissoluble. He made a slight gesture upward with his hand. "You really mortify me, my dear Miss Phoebe," he exclaimed, smiling half sarcastically at her. "My poor story, it is but too evident, will never do for Godey or Graham. Only think of your falling asleep at what I hope the newspaper critics would pronounce a most brilliant, powerful, imaginative, pathetic, and original winding up. Well, the manuscript must serve to light lamps with, if indeed, being so imbued with my gentle dullness, it is any longer capable of flame." "Me asleep? How can you say so?" answered Phoebe, as unconscious of the crisis through which she had passed as an infant of the precipice to the verge of which it has rolled. "No, no, I consider myself as having been very attentive, and though I don't remember the incidents quite distinctly, yet I have an impression of a vast deal of trouble and calamity, so no doubt the story will prove exceedingly attractive." By this time the sun had gone down, and was tinting the clouds toward the zenith with those bright hues which are not seen there until some time after sunset, and when the horizon has quite lost its richer brilliancy. The moon, too, which had long been climbing overhead and unobtrusively melting its disk into the azure, like an ambitious demagogue who hides his aspiring purpose by assuming the prevalent hue of popular sentiment, now began to shine out, broad and oval in its middle pathway. These silvery beams were already powerful enough to change the character of the lingering daylight. They softened and embellished the aspect of the old house, although the shadows fell deeper into the angles of its many gables, and lay brooding under the projecting story and within the half-open door. With the lapse of every moment, the garden grew more picturesque. The fruit trees, shrubbery, and flower bushes had a dark obscurity among them. The commonplace characteristics, which at noontide it seemed to have taken a century of sordid life to accumulate, were now transfigured by a charm of romance. 100 mysterious years were whispering among the leaves, whenever the slight sea breeze found its way thither and stirred them. Through the foliage that roofed the little summer house, the moonlight flickered to and fro, and fell silvery white on the dark floor, the table, and the circular bench, with a continual shift and play, according as the chinks and wayward crevices among the twigs admitted or shut out the glimmer. So sweetly cool was the atmosphere, after all the feverish day, that the summer eve might be fancied as sprinkling dews and liquid moonlight, with a dash of icy temper in them, out of a silver vase. Here and there a few drops of this freshness were scattered on a human heart, and gave it youth again, and sympathy with the eternal youth of nature. The artist chanced to be one on whom the reviving influence fell. It made him feel what he sometimes almost forgot, thrust so early as he had been into the rude struggle of man with man, How youthful he still was! "It seems to me," he observed, "that I never watched the coming of so beautiful an eve, and never felt anything so very much like happiness as at this moment. After all, what a good world we live in! How good and beautiful! How young it is, too, with nothing really rotten or age-worn in it. This old house, for example, which sometimes has positively oppressed my breath with its smell of decaying timber. And this garden, where the black mold always clings to my spade, as if I were a sexton delving in a graveyard. Could I keep the feeling that now possesses me, the garden would every day be virgin soil, with the earth's first freshness in the flavor of its beans and squashes. And the house, it would be like a bower in Eden, blossoming with the earliest roses that God ever made. Moonlight, and the sentiment in man's heart responsive to it, are the greatest of renovators and reformers. And all other reform and renovation, I suppose, will prove to be no better than moonshine. I have been happier than I am now, at least much gayer, said Phoebe thoughtfully. Yet I am sensible of a great charm in this brightening moonlight, and I love to watch how the day, tired as it is, lags away reluctantly, and hates to be called yesterday so soon. I never cared much about moonlight before. What is there, I wonder, so beautiful in it tonight? And you have never felt it before? Inquired the artist, looking earnestly at the girl through the twilight. Never, answered Phoebe, and life does not look the same now that I have felt it so. It seems as if I had looked at everything hitherto in broad daylight, or else in the ruddy light of a cheerful fire, glimmering and dancing through a room. Ah, poor me, she added with a half-melancholy laugh. I shall never be so merry as before I knew Cousin Hepzibah and poor Cousin Clifford. I have grown a great deal older in this little time, older and I hope wiser, and not exactly sadder, but certainly with not half so much lightness in my spirits. I have given them my sunshine, and have been glad to give it, but of course I cannot both give and keep it. They are welcome notwithstanding. You have lost nothing, Phoebe, worth keeping, nor which it was possible to keep, said Holgrave after a pause. Our first youth is of no value, for we are never conscious of it until after it is gone. But sometimes, always I suspect, unless one is exceedingly unfortunate, there comes a sense of second youth, gushing out of the heart's joy at being in love, or possibly it may come to crown some other grand festival in life, if any other such there be. This bemoaning of oneself, as you do now, over the first careless, shallow gaiety of youth departed, and this profound happiness at youth regained, so much deeper and richer than that we lost, are essential to the soul's development. In some cases, the two states come almost simultaneously, and mingle the sadness and the rapture in one mysterious emotion. I hardly think I understand you, said Phoebe. No wonder, replied Holgrave, smiling, for I have told you a secret which I hardly began to know before I found myself giving it utterance. Remember it, however, and when the truth becomes clear to you, then think of this moonlight scene. It is entirely moonlight now, except only a little flush of faint crimson, upward from the west, between those buildings, remarked Phoebe. I must go in. Cousin Hepzibah is not quick at figures, and will give herself a headache over the day's accounts unless I help her. But Holgrave detained her a little longer. Miss Hepzibah tells me, observed he, that you return to the country in a few days. Yes, but only for a little while, answered Phoebe, for I look upon this as my present home. I go to make a few arrangements, and to take a more deliberate leave of my mother and friends. It is pleasant to live where one is much desired and very useful, and I think I may have the satisfaction of feeling myself so here. You surely may, and more than you imagine, said the artist. Whatever health, comfort, and natural life exists in the house is embodied in your person. These blessings came along with you, and will vanish when you leave the threshold. Miss Hepzibah, by secluding herself from society, has lost all true relation with it, and is in fact dead, although she galvanizes herself into a semblance of life, and stands behind her counter, afflicting the world with a greatly to be deprecated scowl. Your poor cousin Clifford is another dead and long-buried person, on whom the governor and council have wrought a necromantic miracle. I should not wonder if he were to crumble away some morning after you are gone, and nothing be seen of him more, except a heap of dust, Miss Hepzibah, at any rate, will lose what little flexibility she has. They both exist by you." "I should be very sorry to think so," answered Phoebe gravely. "But it is true that my small abilities were precisely what they needed, and I have a real interest in their welfare. An odd kind of motherly sentiment, which I wish you would not laugh at. And let me tell you frankly, Mr. Holgrave, I am sometimes puzzled to know whether you wish them well or ill." "Undoubtedly," said the daguerreotypist. "I do feel an interest in this antiquated, poverty-stricken old maiden lady, and this degraded, shattered gentleman, this abortive lover of the beautiful. A kindly interest, too, helpless old children that they are. But you have no conception what a different kind of heart mine is from your own. It is not my impulse, as regards these two individuals, either to help or hinder, but to look on, to analyze, to explain matters to myself, and to comprehend the drama which, for almost 200 years, has been dragging its slow length over the ground where you and I now tread. If permitted to witness the close, I doubt not to derive a moral satisfaction from it, though matters how they may. There is a conviction within me that the end draws nigh. But though Providence send you hither to help, and sends me only as a privileged and meet spectator, I pledge myself to lend these unfortunate beings whatever aid I can." "I wish you would speak more plainly," cried Phoebe, perplexed and displeased, "and above all that you would feel more like a Christian and a human being. How is it possible to see people in distress without desiring, more than anything else, to help and comfort them? You talk as if this old house were a theatre, and you seem to look at Hepzibah's and Clifford's misfortunes, and those of generations before them, as a tragedy, such as I have seen acted in the hall of a country hotel. Only the present one seems to be played exclusively for your amusement. I do not like this. The play costs the performers too much, and the audience is too cold-hearted." "You are severe," said Holgrave, compelled to recognize a degree of truth in the piquant sketch of his own mood. "And then," continued Phoebe, "what can you mean by your conviction, which you tell me of, that the end is drawing near? Do you know of any new trouble hanging over my poor relatives? If so, tell me at once, and I will not leave them." "Forgive me, Phoebe," said the daguerreotypist, holding out his hand, to which the girl was constrained to yield her own. "I am somewhat of a mystic, it must be confessed. The tendency is in my blood, together with the faculty of mesmerism, which might have brought me to Gallows Hill in the good old times of witchcraft. Believe me, if I were really aware of any secret, the disclosure of which would benefit your friends, who are my own friends likewise, you should learn it before we part, but I have no such knowledge." "You hold something back," said Phoebe. "Nothing. No secrets but my own," answered Holgrave. "I can perceive, indeed, that Judge Pyncheon still keeps his eye on Clifford, in whose ruin he had so large a share. His motives and intentions, however, are a mystery to me. He is a determined and relentless man, with the genuine character of an inquisitor, and had he any object to gain by putting Clifford to the rack, I verily believe that he would wrench his joints from their sockets in order to accomplish it. But so wealthy and eminent as he is, so powerful in his own strength, and in the support of society on all sides, what can Judge Pyncheon have to hope or fear from the imbecile-branded, half-torpid Clifford?" "Yet," urged Phoebe, "you did speak as if misfortune were impending." "Oh, that was because I am morbid," replied the artist. "My mind has a twist aside, like almost everybody's mind, except your own. Moreover, it is so strange to find myself an inmate of this old Pyncheon house, and sitting in this garden, hark how Mall's well is murmuring, that were it only for this one circumstance, I cannot help fancying that destiny is arranging its fifth act for a catastrophe." "There!" cried Phoebe with renewed vexation, for she was by nature as hostile to mystery as the sunshine to a dark corner. "You puzzle me more than ever." "Then let us part friends," said Holgrave, pressing her hand. "Or if not friends, let us part before you entirely hate me, you who love everybody else in the world." "Good-bye, then," said Phoebe frankly. "I do not mean to be angry a great while, and should be sorry to have you think so." There has Cousin Hepzibah been standing in the shadow of the doorway this quarter of an hour past. She thinks I stayed too long in the damp garden. So good night and good-bye. On the second morning thereafter, Phoebe might have been seen, in her straw bonnet, with a shawl on one arm and a little carpet-bag on the other, bidding adieu to Hepzibah and Cousin Clifford. She was to take a seat in the next train of cars, which would transport her to within 6 miles of her country village. The tears were in Phoebe's eyes. A smile, dewy with affectionate regret, was glimmering around her pleasant mouth. She wondered how it came to pass that her life of a few weeks, here in this heavy-hearted old mansion, had taken such hold of her, and so melted into her associations, as now to seem a more important centre-point of remembrance than all which had gone before. How had Hepzibah, grim, silent, and irresponsive to her overflow of cordial sentiment, contrived to win so much love? And Clifford, in his abortive decay, with the mystery of fearful crime upon him, and the close prison atmosphere yet lurking in his breath, how had he transformed himself into the simplest child, whom Phoebe felt bound to watch over, and be, as it were, the providence of his unconsidered hours? Everything at that instant of farewell stood out prominently to her view. Look where she would, lay her hand on what she might, the object responded to her consciousness, as if a moist human heart were in it. She peeped from the window into the garden, and felt herself more regretful at leaving this spot of black earth, vitiated with such an age-long growth of weeds, than joyful at the idea of again scenting her pine forests and fresh clover fields. She called Chanticleer, his 2 wives, and the venerable chicken, and threw them some crumbs of bread from the breakfast table. These being hastily gobbled up, the chicken spread its wings and alighted close by Phoebe on the window-sill, where it looked gravely into her face and vented its emotions in a croak. Phoebe bade it be a good old chicken during her absence, and promised to bring it a little bag of buckwheat. "Ah, Phoebe," remarked Hepzibah, "you do not smile so naturally as when you came to us. Then the smile chose to shine out. Now you choose it should. It is well that you are going back, for a little while, into your native air. There has been too much weight on your spirits. The house is too gloomy and lonesome. The shop is full of vexations, and as for me, I have no faculty of making things look brighter than they are. Dear Clifford has been your only comfort." "Come hither, Phoebe," suddenly cried her cousin Clifford, who had said very little all the morning. "Close, closer, and look me in the face." Phoebe put one of her small hands on each elbow of his chair, and leaned her face towards him, so that he might peruse it as carefully as he would. It is probable that the latent emotions of this parting hour had revived in some degree his bedimmed and enfeebled faculties. At any rate, Phoebe soon felt that if not the profound insight of a seer, yet a more than feminine delicacy of appreciation was making her heart the subject of its regard. A moment before, she had known nothing which she would have sought to hide. Now, as if some secret were hinted to her own consciousness through the medium of another's perception, she was fain to let her eyelids droop beneath Clifford's gaze. A blush, too, the redder because she strove hard to keep it down, ascended bigger and higher in a tide of fitful progress until even her brow was all suffused with it. "It is enough, Phoebe," said Clifford with a melancholy smile. "When I first saw you, you were the prettiest little maiden in the world, and now you have deepened into beauty. Girlhood has passed into womanhood. The bud is abloom. Go now, I feel lonelier than I did." Phoebe took leave of the desolate couple, and passed through the shop, twinkling her eyelids to shake off a dewdrop, for considering how brief her absence was to be, and therefore the folly of being cast down about it, she would not so far acknowledge her tears as to dry them with her handkerchief. On the doorstep she met the little urchin, whose marvellous feats of gastronomy have been recorded in the earlier pages of our narrative. She took from the window some specimen or other of natural history, her eyes being too dim with moisture to inform her accurately whether it was a rabbit or a hippopotamus, put it into the child's hand as a parting gift, and went her way. Old Uncle Venner was just coming out of his door, with the wood horse and saw on his shoulder, and trudging along the street, he scrupled not to keep company with Phoebe, so far as their paths lay together. Nor, in spite of his patched coat and rusty beaver, and the curious fashion of his tow-cloth trousers, could she find it in her heart to outwalk him. "We shall miss you next Sabbath afternoon," observed the street philosopher. "It is unaccountable How little while it takes some folks to grow just as natural to a man as his own breath. And begging your pardon, Miss Phoebe, though there can be no offence in an old man's saying it, that's just what you've grown to me. My years have been a great many, and your life is but just beginning. And yet you are somehow as familiar to me as if I had found you at my mother's door, and you had blossomed like a running vine all along my pathway since. Come back soon, or I shall be gone to my farm, for I begin to find these wood-sawing jobs a little too tough for my backache. Very soon, Uncle Venner, replied Phoebe. And let it be all the sooner, Phoebe, for the sake of those poor souls yonder, continued her companion. They can never do without you now, never, Phoebe, never. No more than if one of God's angels had been living with them, and making their dismal house pleasant and comfortable. Don't it seem to you they'd be in a sad case if some pleasant summer morning like this, the angel should spread his wings and fly to the place he came from? Well, just so they feel, now that you're going home by the railroad. They can't bear it, Miss Phoebe, so be sure to come back. I am no angel, Uncle Venner, said Phoebe, smiling as she offered him her hand at the street corner. But I suppose people never feel so much like angels as when they are doing what little good they may. So I shall certainly come back. Thus parted the old man and the rosy girl, and Phoebe took the wings of the morning, and was soon flitting almost as rapidly away, as if endowed with the aerial locomotion of the angels to whom Uncle Venner had so graciously compared her. End of Chapter 14 of The House of the Seven Gables by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Read by Nicodemus.